The lookout shouts, "Iceberg, right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact, but according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for two reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now, it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, the 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray.
A beam of electric light pierces the darkness over the calm waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic is quietly making its way through the waves, its passengers asleep, when suddenly a monstrous white shape is caught in the light beam. The fateful Iceberg is about to rend the side of the legendary ship. April 14, 1912, only 2 days before someone will take a photo of a giant iceberg with a pretty unusual elliptical shape. It turns out that this iceberg most likely formed out of snow that fell 100,000 years ago. Researchers used computer modeling to figure out its origin. They used data from 1912 and added some new information about winds and ocean currents. They concluded that the iceberg was probably a part of a small cluster of glaciers in southwest Greenland. These days, it's possible to calculate the routes of such icebergs in any given year in the past. So the infamous chunk of ice was on its way from Greenland to an area further south from Cornwall. If the ship had passed through that region only 2 days later, the iceberg would have moved far away from the point where they met. At first, the weight of the most well-known iceberg in the world was 75 million tons. With time, it started to slowly melt away, and when it sank the Titanic, its weight was only 1.5 million tons. By the time of the collision, it had probably been melting for months, but it was still a true monster. When the Titanic sank, the iceberg was 400 feet long, and more than 100 feet of its surface was above the water. Some people believe it was a supermoon that caused the Titanic to sink. That night, there was a rare lunar event. It hadn't happened for 1,400 years. In normal conditions, the iceberg wouldn't have traveled so far south without melting and losing the largest part of its mass. But the supermoon could have been the reason for an unusually high tide that pulled the iceberg away from the glacier way faster than usual. There's a specific type of bacteria that slowly consumes the remains of the Titanic. Salt corrosion, ocean currents, freezing temperatures, plus this rust-eating microorganism might consume the entire wreckage. American actress Dorothy Gibson was aboard the Titanic. She survived, and when she arrived in New York, she started filming a movie called Saved from the Titanic almost right away. The movie was released only a month after the Titanic sank, and in the movie, she even wore the same shoes and clothes she had during the actual disaster. The movie was a big success at that time, but the only known copy was destroyed in a fire. 14 years before the Titanic sank, a novella called Futility had been published, and it seemed to have predicted the whole event. The plot centered around a fictional ship called the Titan that sank during its voyage. The Titan was almost the same size as Titanic, and they both went to the bottom in April. The reason was hitting an iceberg, too. Both the real and fictional ships were described as unsinkable, and both of them had the legally required number of lifeboats, which, as it turned out later, were nowhere near enough. We've seen it in the movie, but there were some real-life love stories happening on the Titanic, too. 13 couples even took a trip on the Titanic as part of their honeymoon. One of the couples owned Macy's department store in New York. Once it became clear the Titanic was rapidly sinking, the woman refused to go into a lifeboat without her husband. But he didn't want to join her while there were still women and children who he thought had to go first. Then his wife gave her coat to her maid. She insisted that the maid should get into the lifeboat, and she wanted her to be warm. As for the woman herself, she decided to stay with her husband till the end. Some people believe Titanic sank because of a mummy, not an iceberg. It all started around 1000 BCE with a mysterious woman who lived in Egypt, in the City of Thieves. People knew little about her, but they called her a priestess. Her mummy was put in a wooden sarcophagus and covered with a large lid with the image of her face and some mystical inscriptions. This place had been hidden until the first half of the 19th century, when a group of locals accidentally came across it. They disturbed her peace. No one knows how, but the mummy disappeared that day without a trace. A couple of decades later, a group of rich friends from England traveled to Egypt and found the empty mummy casket with the image of the priestess, whose dark eyes seemed to be looking into the void. They decided to buy it, but the buyer disappeared the same night before he even got the case. All members of the group had some accidents. The casket changed its location a couple of times until it, as some believe, ended up on the Titanic. It took more than 70 years for a robot submarine to find the ruins of this legendary ship. The wreck lies nearly 13,000 feet under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, split into two halves. Why did the liner break apart? No one knows exactly. Some think it happened because of the water that got inside when the ship collided with the iceberg. The pressure was so powerful it separated two parts of the vessel, starting with the ship's bottom structure. Others say it was because of the hull rivets. They had a high concentration of slag or smelting residue, and that's something that can cause the metal to split apart. The ship generally had many flaws, starting with the design. The watertight bulkheads weren't completely sealed on top. This allowed the water to flow between the compartments and, in the end, sink the vessel. The iron of the ship's rivets and steel of the hull ended up ruined because of high sulfur content, cold temperatures, and high speeds. The steel shattered and the rivets popped out quite easily. Because of this, Titanic sank 24 times faster than it would have otherwise. If the ship had hit the iceberg head-on instead of ramming it with its side, it would have probably stayed afloat. How come the crew members didn't have binoculars? It would have surely helped them spot the iceberg on time and maybe even avoid the disaster. But the binoculars on the Titanic were locked in a storage cabinet. Only one crew member had the key, and he had been transferred off the ship right before it set sail. He later said he hadn't remembered to hand over the key. But even without the binoculars, the ship might have had some time to change course and avoid the collision if the crew had gotten some warning. But that's the thing, someone did warn them. About an hour before the incident, a ship that was relatively close to Titanic, the SS Californian, sent a message to inform them it had stopped because of dense ice field. But the warning never got to the Titanic's captain. Some experts say it was because the radio operator didn't think it was that urgent. And later, the SS Californian said they didn't get a call for help from the Titanic because their radio operator was off duty. Some say the crew on the Titanic couldn't spot the iceberg on time because of an optical illusion. Atmospheric conditions that night probably caused super refraction, which could have camouflaged the berg. After all, no one actually saw the iceberg until it was too close to the ship to somehow avoid the crash. Not even a whole minute passed between the moment they saw the iceberg and the collision. It was only 37 seconds, and it took Titanic 2 hours and 40 minutes to disappear below the ocean's waves.
April 1912 marked one of the most terrible tragedies in the history of the world. The most unsinkable vessel, the pinnacle of engineering at that time, the huge Titanic, sank. On that dark, moonless night, the ship had many chances to save its passengers. There was another ship just a few miles away that could have saved the Titanic, but it didn't. It wasn't a phantom ship, and it's not some legend or a theory. This is a documented reality. There are records and witnesses' statements confirming this. But why didn't this ship help? Let's find out what happened that night by looking at these events from 3 different points of view. Let's start with the Titanic version. 11:30 p.m. The moon hides behind black clouds. Visibility is bad. Everything is calm on the Titanic. Under the captain's guidance, the communications operator stays in touch with the mainland through the radio. At this moment, some stranger breaks into the frequency, interrupting the operator's communication. It's unclear what this strange man wants and what he's talking about. The operator doesn't try to figure it out. He shouts at the guy, demanding him to disconnect. The connection is interrupted. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic crashes into an iceberg. The ice breaks the hull. Water begins to flood the lower decks. Nobody is panicking yet. 20 minutes later, at midnight, the ship's crew sends a distress signal through the radio frequency. Few people understand how bad the situation really is. After 20 minutes, at 12:20 a.m., they start lowering lifeboats with passengers. At 12:25 a.m., they receive a response to the distress signal. This is RMS Carpathia. Their captain reports they're already sailing at maximum speed towards the Titanic. But the problem is that the crash site is 58 miles away. This means Carpathia will only be here in 4 hours. At 12:45 a.m., the sinking ship's crew release rockets into the air. These flares are one of the main reasons for the terrible fate of many passengers, but more on that later. 90 minutes later, the Titanic's deck breaks and the ship dives underwater. At 4:10 a.m., the Carpathia finally arrives at the shipwreck location. The crew members make heroic efforts to save all the people. They take 705 survivors on board. At this moment, another ship appears. It's SS Californian. The Carpathia sails towards the New York coast with all the people. The Californian floats in search of passengers and finds nothing but wreckage. The ship was only a few miles away while the Titanic sank into the icy water. The Californian could have saved these people, but did nothing. Its captain, Stanley Lord, made one of the most terrible acts that a sailor can allow. He didn't help a sinking ship. When the world found out about all this, they detested Captain Lord. They couldn't bring charges against him, and the trial didn't punish him. But his career was ruined entirely, as no other ship company would hire him. Despite this, he never confessed he had been guilty. Before he passed away, the captain said it hadn't been his fault. If this was true, then what happened there? This brings us to the Californian version. It's the night of April 14th. The Californian is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The ship gets into a section with a lot of icebergs. At 10:10 p.m., Captain Lord stops the ship. It's too dangerous to move around this area, as they can damage the hull. At 11 p.m., the ship starts drifting. It's impossible to move in such conditions with such poor visibility. The captain knows that the Titanic is coming here, so he orders the radio operator to warn the ship about the danger. Radio operator Evans turns on the receiver and tries to contact the Titanic. He spends about 30 minutes on it. The connection is finally established. At this moment, the Titanic radio operator is speaking with the mainland. Evans interrupts this conversation and tries to warn the ship about icebergs. The operator doesn't understand Evans' words. He's annoyed because Evans broke into the channel so brazenly. He shouts at Evans and cuts the connection. Tired, Evans turns off the receiver and informs his superiors about the incident. It's still a mystery how the captain reacted to this news. He probably thought the Titanic knew about the danger. He lets Evans go to bed. If Evans hadn't turned off the radio and waited 1 hour, he would have heard a distress signal from the Titanic. But you shouldn't blame him. At this point, he has no official reason to stay at the transmitter. Evans is too exhausted and can't fight drowsiness. So, Evans goes to bed. The Titanic begins to sink. Its captain sends a distress signal. The operator on board the Carpathia catches it, but the Californian doesn't, since the receiver is turned off. Captain Lord can't sleep. He feels that something is wrong. Meanwhile, the Titanic is rapidly sinking under the water. The captain gives the order to launch rockets into the air. And here is where one of the critical mistakes takes place. They release warning lights, but they are not red. The crew forgot to take red rockets on board for some reason, so they lit up the sky with a bright white light. If you need to send a distress signal, you need to release red lights. Captain Lord sees these lights, but doesn't perceive them as a cry for help. It can't be that there are no standard red rockets on such a massive ship as the Titanic. But, unfortunately, it can. Captain Lord thinks the Titanic is sailing away. Perhaps there is some unknown reason behind those white lights, but he doesn't really know. So, Captain Lord has no idea that the Titanic is sinking. He still decides to contact the ship, but this time, not through radio communication. Captain Lord doesn't wake up the radio operator and sends a signal to the Titanic through a signal lamp. It's important to understand that many old-school captains didn't take radio communication seriously. They didn't understand the value of this technology. That's why Captain Lord doesn't wake up Evans. He sends light signals, but the Titanic doesn't respond. Many survivors later mentioned seeing the flashing lights of the Californian, but there was nothing they could have done. The ship's crew doesn't hear their cries for help. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic completely goes underwater. A little more than 2 hours later, radio operator Evans wakes up and turns the transmitter on. He hears many rescuers talking about the sunken ship. Evans understands everything. He reports this to the captain. At that moment, the Californian immediately heads to the wreck site. They meet Carpathia there. With the survivors on board, it sails towards New York. The Californian stays sailing and looking for people. They find nothing but wreckage. The Californian returns to the mainland. The news about the ship that could have saved the Titanic is spreading all over the country. The trial begins. Captain Stanley Lord and the crew tell their version. They say their ship had been standing still. Many people don't believe them, and some of the surviving passengers claim to have seen the Californian sailing by. Still, the judge declares them innocent. 1962. Captain Stanley Lord is a very old man. He calls a notary to confess something. The captain makes his last remark about this case. He swears he's not guilty. But if it wasn't the Californian sailing past the Titanic at that moment, then what? The Samson theory could answer that question for us. The sealing ship Samson is sailing in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The crew aren't sleeping. They carefully study the surroundings, but not because they're afraid of icebergs. They're scared of meeting with the U.S. Coast Guard. The Samson ship's crew catch seals, which is illegal. At 12:45 a.m., Samson's captain sees white signal rockets. The team is sure it's the Coast Guard. They turn off the lights and sail away. It's dark, so they don't notice the sinking Titanic. They return to the coast of Iceland and hear about the disaster. They realize they have abandoned the drowning passengers. The nephew of one of Samson's crew members reads about this story in his uncle's diary. The nephew asks for permission to publish these recordings. All the people realize that Captain Lord wasn't guilty, but unfortunately, he didn't live to see this moment. Actually, it's still unknown who is guilty in this story. 2 ships were nearby the Titanic. Their captains were adequate people. They would have helped save all the passengers. Their fault was that they couldn't understand what the Titanic wanted on that dark night. Someone forgot to put red flares in the box. This small but fatal detail was one of the leading causes of the tragedy. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic made contact with an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. Many artifacts were found and restored, like parts of the ship, jewelry, and dining plates, to name a few. It took approximately 3 hours for the ship to be completely submerged in the remote icy water. The night was cold and very much alive. The orchestra was playing music as they enchanted the guests on board. Everyone was excited to arrive in America. It was still considered an amazing feat for a ship to cross the Atlantic back in 1912. But as the day went ahead, there was an atmosphere of impending doom for the captain and his crew. No one else felt it though. It seemed to them nothing could possibly go wrong, and this would just be another regular night. To them, the Titanic was unsinkable. The last thing on your mind when thinking about the Titanic is the mail crew. Yes, there were mailmen on board delivering mail to America. It may seem like a pretty mundane occupation, but there was a very tough test to pass in order to be accepted on board. And only a few top candidates would qualify, and those few would get shortlisted and accepted. John Starr March, an American, was one of these mailmen earning between $1,000 to $1,500 a year working on the Titanic. Back in 1912, this was considered to be a lot of money. They were not officially part of the ship's crew, since the mail crew was placed near the third-class quarters. But given their influence and resistance, they were eventually moved and given a private dining area. March got this job since he needed the money to support his family. He found a perfect way to earn some big bucks, working on a large ship traveling across the ocean. He was 51 at the time and came from New Jersey. Sadly, he was on board when the ship sank and didn't make it. But they recovered a pocket watch that gives us a little insight into what happened that fateful evening. It's a gold case engraved with filigree and had a caption saying it was made by the Elgin National Watch Company. On the surface, you'd think this would just make a pretty cool antique sitting over the fireplace, but there are some unusual details about it. There are obvious signs water seeped beneath the glass, and the black arms of the watch indicate the time to be exactly 1:27. It leaves us wondering why the clock stopped at this precise hour. What was the owner doing? The mail clerks were operating a fully functioning and efficient mail sorting facility on board the Titanic. This wasn't something you'd come by often on a cruise ship, since typical ocean liners use closed mail bags to transport the mail from one port to another. But the mail sorting facility on the Titanic allowed passengers to send out postcards whenever the ship docked in transit zones in Ireland and France. According to reports, people started heading back to their rooms at around 11 p.m., but some of them were still hanging around and enjoying their night. The 5 mailmen were celebrating a colleague's birthday in their separate dining room. 5 minutes before impact, crew members spotted the iceberg and rang the bell 3 times as a warning that something was ahead of the ship. They gave orders for the Titanic to move left, or, as they say in the biz, hard a starboard, to make the engines reverse. It was not enough to avoid the great impact. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg, and disaster erupted on the inside. Not just water seeping in and ultimately sinking the ship, but panic and chaos among the passengers and crew members. Captain Smith reached the deck and was informed that the Titanic had hit an iceberg. And at the same time, the mailroom began filling with water. We know that the 880-foot ship was completely submerged at around 2:20 a.m., with 706 survivors. The time between the impact and the sinking was really eventful. At midnight, they started getting the lifeboats ready for the passengers to evacuate. Orders were given for women and children to board the safety boats with some crewmen to guide and operate them. The problem was that the 20 safety boats available could only host 1,178 people out of the total of more than 2,200 passengers on board. March and his colleagues began sorting out the mail. There was chaos in directing and ordering around. With each second passing, icy cold water was filling the ship. 15 minutes after midnight, Captain Smith ordered his crew members to send out a distress signal. Even though SOS was established earlier than the Titanic, many others used CQD. The CQ stands for General Call, and the D is Distress. The Frankfurt was too far away to help, even though it was one of the first to respond. Even the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, responded, but it also was too far away. At 12:20 a.m., the Carpathia received the urgent message and redirected from its original course to help them out, even though they were 58 nautical miles away. Although this was some relieving news, the water kept seeping in at an alarming rate. It wasn't easy to keep everyone calm, knowing that the ship could be underwater in a matter of hours. At this point, many passengers were already on board the safety boats, waiting to descend into the water. The musicians on board began playing music for the ones still waiting. At first, they were playing in the first-class lounge, and then they moved to the deck. There's a debate on how long they were playing for, and what song it was. None of the musicians made it out. The 5 mailmen on board were also doing their duties while the ship was sinking. According to a ship officer, the mailroom was already covered in water above the ankles, and the mailmen were busy trying to save as much mail as they could. March was one of them. There were bags of mail floating around. They started with the registered mail. Witnesses of the Titanic sinking reported the mailmen were putting bags of mail on the deck to keep them from getting wet until help arrived. They also mentioned bags of mail were floating about in the freezing water. It wasn't until 12:45 a.m. when lifeboat number 7 on the left side of the ship was lowered onto the water. Even though it had room for roughly 65 people, only 27 people were inside. Many of the safety boats carried fewer passengers than their maximum capacity allowed. The crew were worried that the boats would capsize if so many people were on them. Some reports suggest that some people even refused to board the safety ships, sticking with the claim that the Titanic was unsinkable. At the same time, they fired up one of the 8 distress rockets in the air, but it didn't get them any help. At 12:55 a.m., the second and third safety boats were descended to the waters with 2 male passengers jumping on board. 5 minutes later, another safety boat was lowered with around 39 people. At this point, water entered the base of the grand staircase. In the next 20 minutes, more safety boats were lowered, most of them underloaded. Still no help. The Carpathia was still on the way. Panic was growing, and tensions were rising. There was a lot of anger for people being left behind. At around 1:30 a.m., things were getting out of control. The organized boarding of passengers to the safety boats stopped. March's watch stopped 3 minutes earlier, which could mean he was part of the scuffle between crew members and passengers. It took 3 hours for the Carpathia to arrive. March wasn't among the survivors. His watch proved to be one of the essential findings lost in the wreckage of the Titanic. It was eventually returned to March's 2 daughters, and now it's in one of the collections of the National Postal Museum. March was a man who did what he had to do in the worst circumstances. Time was a precious commodity for the people on board the ship, and this watch proved valuable to learn more about the tragic yet inspiring stories of the Titanic.
Once a famous giant, the largest ship of that time. Now 2 grand pieces lying on the ocean bottom about 2,000 feet apart, torn by the catastrophic collision of time itself. The stern of the Titanic got completely ruined after hitting the ocean floor. But you can still recognize the bow since many interiors were left preserved. There's a type of bacteria found on the ship's rusticles. A rusticle is this brownish formation of rust. It occurs deep underwater when the wrought iron the ship is made of oxidizes. It means the bacteria eat the iron of the Titanic's hull, piece by piece. And it seems they might finish their snack by 2030, way sooner than when anyone would expect the wreck to be gone forever. You may think it would probably be easier to take the wreck out of the water so that we got to keep it, but it would fall apart if anyone tried to do that. It's been in the water for more than 110 years now, and is now so rusty that no one would be able to reconstruct some parts even if we managed to get the ship out of the ocean depths. What do you think? Could any of about 700 people that had survived the sinking of the Titanic hear it hit the ocean bottom? The largest ship that had ever been made till then disappeared literally before their eyes after all. But sound most likely wouldn't have traveled from water to air. We can't hear that well in water because our bodies are not designed to hear in such environments. And although passengers were close to the sinking site, the Titanic still hit the bottom a long distance away, 12,500 feet. There are so many underwater landslides and earthquakes we cannot hear, and they make way more noise than a single ship slamming into the ocean floor. Most vibrations and sounds must have dispersed over a large area. Also, the downblast of water, which many believe hit the Titanic after it had touched the bottom of the ocean, would have pushed back the majority of the potential acoustic vibrations. Plus, the bottom of the ocean is not hard enough to produce such loud noises. Many survivors said they had heard terrifying noises as the Titanic was breaking apart, but none mentioned hearing anything after the ship disappeared below the surface of the water. Some survivors shared how chaotic it was when passengers, mainly women and children, were getting into lifeboats. There weren't enough boats, and still, some of them weren't even filled to their full capacity. No one knew how to react properly in such a situation. The lifeboat drill had been scheduled for the morning before the Titanic hit the iceberg, but for some reason, it got canceled. A giant ocean liner everyone believes is unsinkable takes a trip across the ocean. On its way, it strikes an iceberg and sinks. Yeah, we all know how the story goes. But what's scary is that it's also the plot of The Wreck of the Titan, a novel published in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic went to the ocean bottom or was even constructed. In the novel, the Titan, what a scarily accurate name too, didn't have enough life jackets, vests, and lifeboats for all the passengers on board. It was also the largest ship of that time, almost identical in size to the Titanic, and both the Titan and Titanic sank in April. Dorothy Gibson was an American silent film actress. She was also one of the Titanic passengers. She survived the catastrophe. Right after she came to New York, she started filming Saved from the Titanic. The film was released only 1 month after the ship sank. Dorothy was even wearing the same shoes and clothes she had worn when she had actually been on the ship. The movie was successful, but it got destroyed in a fire, so it only exists in memories, like Jack Dawson. Titanic wasn't all alone in the restless waves of the cold ocean near the iceberg it struck. The SS Californian was relatively close. Their radio was shut off for that night though. At one moment, the crew members noticed mysterious lights in the sky. They immediately went to wake their captain up to tell him, but he issued no orders. Some believed it was just fireworks. They never realized it was actually a call for help. The flares crew members of the Titanic sent off to the sky, hoping someone would notice. By the time the SS Californian got the SOS message, it was already too late. Some say a full moon may have been the reason the iceberg crossed paths with the gigantic ship. A full moon may have caused incredibly strong tides that eventually sent multiple icebergs southward, right when the Titanic was crossing that area. Would you dare to taste cheese from the Titanic? The wreck has been under the ocean surface for more than 100 years now. It took more than 70 years to find it. By that time, most of the food that had gone down together with the ship had, of course, spoiled. But it's possible there's still some of it left. Some foods are protected from decay. For example, cheese. The microbes that turn milk into cheese create special conditions to protect the product from spoiling. Multiple things have survived the Titanic. A handwritten letter where a mother and a daughter wrote to the girl's grandma about the amazing journey they were on together. The letter has been around for more than 100 years and got sold at an auction. A battered pair of white cotton gloves was found in the wreck. Musicians on the Titanic played till the very last moment. Sheet music and one violin were found among the wreckage. The bell one of the crew members rang 3 times to warn there was a very close iceberg on their way. A pocket watch that stopped at 1:45 a.m., the time when the ship went under the water. Perhaps one person could have changed what happened on the Titanic. David Blair was a pretty lucky man. He was supposed to take the spot of the second officer of the Titanic. He was pulled out at the last moment, which eventually saved his life. It was a great thing for him, but something clouded his joy. What if he was the only person who could have done something to save the ship and the passengers? Back in the day, ships didn't have smart advanced technology like they do today. They couldn't see a threat on the horizon. Binoculars were pretty helpful, but the crew members on the Titanic didn't have access to the room where they were kept. David Blair was the man responsible for the keys. He left the ship in a hurry and forgot to hand over the keys that were in his pocket. Maybe if the crew members had had access to the binoculars, they would have seen the iceberg on time and had enough time to change course. It's possible that the giant iceberg that sent the Titanic to the ocean bottom was made of snow that had fallen in southwest Greenland. Scientists even used a computer model to calculate the paths the iceberg took in any given year, taking into consideration ocean currents and weather readings for that year. It's possible that the iceberg was 1,700 feet long, with a weight of around 75 tons. By the time it collided with the Titanic, it had dwindled down to only 1.5 tons. Violet Constance Jessup was, as many called her, Miss Unsinkable. She was only 24 years old when she joined the Titanic crew as a stewardess. On the tragic night when the ship struck the iceberg, she was lying in bed. As soon as she heard that something was going on, she got dressed and quickly went to the deck. Violet helped passengers get into lifeboats. 4 years later, she was on the Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship. Once again, the ship started sinking. Not only did the woman survive another accident, but she was also once again the one helping other people to escape the vessel before it disappeared below the surface.
April 14, 1912. The dark night was filled with horrible sounds of a giant metal vessel breaking into two. The largest ship of that time collided with an iceberg that was on its way. The Titanic, one of the biggest stories of the 20th century that people still talk about. the starboard side of the giant vessel brushed up against the iceberg. It was 11:40 p.m. when things started going wrong. This iceberg caused enough damage for at least 5 watertight compartments in the hull to start filling with water. The crew immediately began a brief investigation to see if they could do anything and fix things. They had no one to rely on, all alone in the darkness of the cold night, far away from the land. The North Atlantic Ocean, around 400 miles south of Newfoundland, Canada. They needed time to figure out how to bring people to safety. They had some time, true, but not enough. If you watched the movie, you know the ship didn't plunge immediately after the icy doom had happened. The whole process lasted a good 2 hours and 40 minutes. But the situation was hard. There were 2,200 people to take care of, including crew and passengers, and things happening on the ship were chaotic. The chief designer, Thomas Andrews, soon realized they wouldn't be able to stay afloat. By midnight, the entire crew had begun preparing the lifeboats for launch. They had 20 boats with space for only 1,178 people, which was just a bit more than 50% of the people on board. The order was to get women and children to safety first. Crewmen were there to row and guide the boats. The scene over the next 2 hours gradually started escalating. The crew members had a task to wake up passengers and warn them something bad was happening. They wanted to place them into a fleet of lifeboats as soon as possible. At 12:15 a.m., some crew members sent out a distress signal. A steamship called Frankfurt was among the first ones that received the message and responded, but they were about 170 nautical miles away. Some other ships also got the message and offered their assistance, but sadly, they were too far away as well. At 12:20 a.m., the Cunard liner Carpathia got a distress signal from the Titanic and changed its course right away. They were 58 miles away at the time, and it would take them more than 3 hours to get there. 20 minutes later, the crew was lowering the first lifeboat. It was carrying only 27 passengers, although it had room for 65. Many of the lifeboats that were launched first were well below capacity. Crew members were worried, thinking the Davits wouldn't be able to hold a fully loaded lifeboat. And in the beginning, many passengers were just too afraid to leave the ship. They still thought Titanic was unsinkable and couldn't imagine the scenario that was going to happen 1 to 2 hours later. The crew was firing the first of 8 distress rockets. Unsuccessful. No one was close enough to help. By 1:20 a.m., they lowered 10 lifeboats. Number 8 had only 28 people in it. One of the passengers on the number 10 was 9-week-old Melvina Dean. She would later become the last survivor who lived until 2009 and turned 97. It was 2 a.m. already. 3 of the collapsible boats were the only lifeboats that remained on the ship. The bow of the vessel had sunk low and had tipped far under the surface. People around it could now clearly see stern propellers above the water. Crew members were lowering collapsible lifeboat D from the roof of the officers' quarters with over 20 passengers in it. As the ship's bow went under, the water was washing collapsible A from the deck. Those 20 people were struggling because their boat was partly filled with water. As crew members were trying to release collapsible B, it fell. Before they righted it, the water swept it off the ship. 30 passengers still managed to find safety on the overturned lifeboat. At 2:17 a.m., the ship's wireless operator decided to transmit one last distress call. A minute later, the light on the ship finally went out. Titanic and all left on board plunged into darkness. The bow continued to sink, and the stern was rising higher above the surface, which placed great strain on the midsection. Horrible sounds were filling the night. Titanic, this massive, legendary ship so many people placed their hopes in and were excited about, broke into 2 between the 3rd and 4th funnels. Reports would speculate it took about 6 minutes for the bow section to reach the ocean bottom. The stern settled back in the water before it rose again into a vertical position. It remained in this situation until it finally disappeared into the ocean. At 2:20 a.m., the stern apparently retained air inside, and water pressure crushed it as it went down. The stern landed about 2,000 feet away from the bow. People consider the Titanic the fastest ship in the world. They thought it was unsinkable because 4 of its compartments could be flooded, and that still wouldn't cause a critical loss of buoyancy. Its life was problematic since its beginning. While the ship was leaving port, it moved within a couple of feet of the steamer New York. It managed to safely pass by, which was a huge relief for all those worried passengers massed on the ship's decks. Titanic sailed off on the 10th of April. Its first journey was across the highly competitive Atlantic route. On the launch day, the Titanic became the biggest movable object in the history of humankind, 882 feet long, 92 feet wide. Not that big if you compare it with today's ships. The biggest cruise ship in the world today is Royal Caribbean's Symphony of the Seas, which is roughly 5 times the size of Titanic. If you put that ship in a vertical position, it would be nearly as tall as the Empire State Building, which is 1,250 feet without antennas. But Titanic was a huge attraction back in its time. At one moment of their journey, they stopped in France, after which they made another stop in Ireland. Once the final passengers boarded, the massive ship set out at full speed for their final destination, New York City. 4 days after the beginning of its journey, Titanic failed to divert its course from a huge iceberg, the story we all know about. Only 700 people survived, and most of them were women and children. The night was extremely cold, 1 hour and 20 minutes after Titanic had gone down to the bottom of the ocean. Survivors weren't even sure someone was coming to save them. Finally, they saw the light. It was Carpathia coming towards them. They came for the people in the lifeboats. The crew brought them aboard and pulled a handful of other passengers out of the water. Many ships tried to contact Titanic a few hours after it sank. Their messages were never returned. Later, when there was an investigation of what really happened, they discovered the Leyland liner Californian had been less than 20 miles away when Titanic was sinking. But the crew didn't hear the distress signals coming from Titanic because their radio operator was off duty. Countries from both sides of the Atlantic were shocked and horrified when they heard details of what happened to Titanic. They decided to make changes to ship operations, rules that would help avoid such events in the future. They held the first International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, where they adopted rules for every ship to have lifeboat space for each passenger on board. Also, lifeboat drills became mandatory. They also decided to establish an international ice patrol. Its main role was to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ships also needed to maintain a 24-hour radio watch. Titanic wasn't built alone. Because of the size of this magnificent ship and all the new equipment it required, it would have been too expensive as a one-off. So the team built the Titanic alongside 2 sister ships, and both of them had eventful lifetimes. RMS Olympic came first. It was launched in 1910, and for a whole year was the biggest liner in the world. The Britannic was another sister ship that sailed for a while before it too ended down on the ocean bottom. But only Titanic became a legend and one of the most fascinating stories of modern history.
Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, but not many people know that Titanic had 2 sister ships, and that on the night of its sinking, one of them was rushing to help but didn't make it in time. Bad luck seemed to follow the trio of ships. but each one of them had glorious moments that live in the minds of those who sailed in them. Keep on watching to discover a story of awe, ingenuity, and ill fate. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn notifications on to join us on the bright side of life. You know how the iceberg hit the Titanic, how the band played to the end, and how the whole tragedy unfolded, but before it happened, it would have seemed an impossibility for such a ship to meet the end it did. None of that could have been foreseen by White Star Line, the company who built the Titanic, who had high hopes for what the unsinkable ship and its sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic, would accomplish. The Olympic was the first of the trio to make sail on June 11, 1911, heading towards New York. The sheer size of it would wow the crowds. The Olympic's maiden voyage went without incident, and a crowd of 8,000 people in New York got to explore its luxurious accommodations while it was docked there. There were high expectations for the massive ship, but just around 2 months later, the Olympic crashed with the HMS Hawk. The Hawk got the brunt of the damage as the bow was left flat as a pancake. After the crash, the Olympic made its way slowly back to Belfast, where the Titanic was being constructed. On the dock, people could see the two enormous ships side by side, as parts of the Titanic were used to put the Olympic back in shape. A rare sight to behold. And on April 14, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg, and minutes later, the crew radioed nearby ships for help. That night, the Olympic was returning from New York when it received the distress signal. The ship turned around and rushed at full speed towards the Titanic, but they were so far away that they would have arrived next night. At some point during the early hours of April 15, 1912, the crew of the Olympic decided they wouldn't make it in time and stopped course. The survivors of the Titanic were eventually rescued by the Carpathia. Olympic was set up with lifeboats for all crew and passengers after the Titanic sank. It went from having 20 lifeboats to 64. Changes were also made to the watertight bulkheads, and an extra hull to construct a type of double hull was installed. It was determined that a double hull would have kept the Titanic from sinking. For several years, Olympic was used in the war effort against Germany. Throughout the years, Olympic carried over 200,000 passengers, which included thousands of Americans fleeing from Europe and troops battling during World War I. One of the most significant moments for this ship was when it struck a German submarine and sank it. It was discovered that the submarine was preparing to fire a torpedo on the Olympic before Olympic rammed it. The Olympic ended up sailing the seas for 3 decades, which earned her the nickname of the Old Reliable, despite some previous accidents. It went on to help the survivors on the HMS Audacious when it was sinking, and do what it couldn't for its sister, Titanic. Eventually, bad luck caught up with the Olympic. The ship crashed with the Nantucket Lightship, and the crash signaled the beginning of the end. Beaten up, and after years of service, the Olympic was demolished and scrapped for parts. The Old Reliable saw many years of service and thousands of passengers, but the Britannic's journey was shorter-lived. When the Titanic sank, White Star Line was faced with a problem since they already had another enormous ship in the works. White Star Line began construction on the HMHS Britannic on November 30th, 1911, around 4 months before the Titanic sank. Although the Britannic was the youngest of the trio of ships, having been constructed last, it was also the biggest. They intended to name it Gigantic, but after the Titanic's disaster, they changed the name to Britannic, since they considered it to be a lucky name. With the Titanic sinking, the White Star Line underwent rigorous investigation, and many changes were made to the Britannic's design. The Britannic looked very similar to the Titanic, and it had what was at the time the largest marine turbine in the world, able to reach faster speeds than the Olympic. With Titanic's fate fresh in their minds, everything possible was done to ensure the safety of this newer ship. The Britannic was eventually launched on February 26, 1914, almost 2 years after Titanic met its end. After the Titanic's disaster, the White Star Line wanted the Britannic to redeem their name. The Britannic was on its way to becoming a successful ship. It transported passengers for over a year and a half when the British government requisitioned it and turned it into a hospital ship during the beginning of World War I. The ship became an even more impressive sight to look at. It was painted all white, with enormous red crosses on its side to indicate it was a hospital ship. One of the ship's surgeons, Dr. J.T.H. Beaumont, thought of it as the most wonderful hospital ship that ever sailed the seas. It could treat as many as 3,309 patients at once. This is how the Britannic became His Majesty's hospital ship, or HMHS Britannic. Though the sight of this magnificent ship must have put a smile on a wounded soldier's face or two, the Britannic didn't operate for long. Just a year after it was turned into a hospital ship, the Britannic was making its way through the Aegean Sea to pick up wounded soldiers, when it was struck by a loud explosion. The passengers didn't know what had happened, but headed to the deck to disembark. It is unclear what hit the Britannic, but the general consensus is that it was struck by a mine left by a German U-boat, though some still believe a torpedo hit it. The captain tried to move the ship to a beach close by, but the ship was sinking fast. In the desperation, against the captain's orders, several crew members launched lifeboats and disembarked. But since the ship was moving and the propellers working, the lifeboats were sucked and destroyed by the propellers. Though so much effort had gone in to ensure the Britannic was safer than the Titanic, whatever explosion occurred left the Britannic in the same dire condition as the Titanic in just 10 minutes. In a cruel twist of fate, it also sank in the ocean. Unlike Titanic's enormous death toll, only 30 people perished in the sinking of the Britannic, and over 1,000 survived. So many people survived because the accident happened in the morning, when the temperature of the water was warmer and the Greek island Kea was close by to offer help. In the end, the Britannic only sailed the seas for over 2.5 years. The bad luck that followed the Titanic and the Britannic and the accidents and demise of the Olympic was remarkable. But what was most impressive is that there was a woman who sailed on all 3 ships and survived. Violet Jessup was a crew member and nurse aboard the ships. She was there when the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawk in 1911 and disembarked safely. 2 years later, she escaped the sinking of the Titanic in lifeboat number 16, and she showed some women it was safe to board the lifeboats. You'd imagine that would be enough to keep her from ever getting on a boat again, but not for her. A few years later, she served as a nurse in the Britannic while it was used as a hospital ship. When the explosion occurred, Violet jumped overboard, was pulled under by the water, and hit her head on the keel but survived. Can you imagine her experience? She must have had nerves of steel. All in all, the trio of ships saw journeys of triumph and tragedy. Ill fate might have followed them, but all the survivors were left with incredible stories to tell. So tell us, Brightsiders, would you have liked to have seen any of these ships in real life? Let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to give this video a like, share it with your friends, and click subscribe to stay on the bright side.
April 14th, 1912. A cold evening somewhere in the North Atlantic. On board the most modern and unsinkable ship, the Titanic, a dinner is held. 2 well-dressed men are sitting at one of the tables. One of them is a famous British journalist. He tells his interlocutor an interesting and at the same time terrible story. It all started about 1000 BCE in ancient Egypt. At that time, one woman was born in the city of Thebes. No one knew who she was or what she did, but she had a high social standing. Towards the end of her life, she was proclaimed a priestess in the College of Amen-Ra. Her body was embalmed, placed in a wooden casket, and covered with a massive lid bearing the image of a woman and mysterious inscriptions. She was buried in Thebes along with other people of the upper class. The mummy of this woman lay at rest for almost 3,000 years. The burial place had been carefully hidden. Around the first half of the 19th century, a group of locals accidentally discovered the ancient tomb. They disturbed the peace of the priestess. No one knows exactly what happened that day, but the mummy was removed from the casket and disappeared without a trace. A few decades later, a group of 4 wealthy friends from England came to Egypt for a trip across the upper part of the Nile. First, they went to visit the excavations of the Temple of Amen-Ra near the city of Luxor. There, they found the empty mummy case. It depicted the priestess with dark eyes looking into the void. There was something sinister in her gaze. They didn't know who the case belonged to, but they were so amazed by the beauty and energy of that find that they decided to buy it from the locals. The buyer disappeared the same night before the case was delivered to him at the hotel. Some said they'd seen the man leave the hotel and go towards the desert. No one knew why he did it. No one else saw him afterwards. Another man from the same group took the casket. During their return home, one of the friends was seriously injured. After arriving in London, the new case owner discovered the bank where all his money was placed had gone bankrupt. In one day, the man turned from a wealthy businessman into a beggar. A third friend also experienced the sinister influence of the ancient find. He lost his health, job, and eventually even his life in an accident shortly after returning to London. Before going bankrupt, the owner gave the ancient casket to his sister who lived in London. One of the friends of this woman came into the room, saw the Egyptian artifact, and immediately felt the dangerous energy emanating from it. Then the owner's sister gave the case to a famous photographer. He took some photos and was horrified. According to his words, he saw a real priestess with a human face in the photos. She looked at him with an ominous, icy gaze. No one except the photographer touched the film of the camera. No one changed the photo. Shortly after, the photographer mysteriously went missing. From that point, the story becomes vague. According to one version, the owner's sister gave the artifact to the British Museum. The man who transported the case passed away soon after, and his assistant got into a terrible accident. Another version says that the item from the Egyptian tomb was bought by a rich businessman. After that, 3 members of his family also had an accident, and his house burned down. Convinced the mummy case was cursed, he gave it to the British Museum. The interlocutor listens to the story with such interest that he forgot about dinner, which has gone cold. "How did you know all this?" he asks. The journalist replies he has been studying everything related to the mummy and its owners for several months. He found evidence of all the accidents and put together the full picture. "So, what happened next?" the interlocutor asks. It seems the mummy case should find peace in the museum. The priestess was surrounded by other kings and queens from different times. However, there was no peace. Scientists and ancient languages experts tried to decipher the symbols on the case. They found out that most of the inscriptions meant curses and misfortunes addressed to those who'd dare to disturb the peace of the priestess. Every night, the guards and museum staff heard the knocking coming from the mummy case. The knocking was accompanied by crying and screaming. Also, someone scattered other exhibits all over the hall every night. Everyone soon came to believe that the priestess's spirit continued to use magic forces. Then, one private collector became interested in the case. He bought it from the museum, not for his collection, but to try to expel the spirit of the mummy from the artifact. It's not known in what ways he tried to do this, but he failed. Then, he managed to sell the mummy case to a rich American archaeologist. That guy decided to move the mummy to New York. And what? What happened next? The interlocutor asks with interest. "That's it. End of story," the journalist answers. "What do you mean? What happened to the mummy? Where is it now?" The journalist looks at the interlocutor with some excitement. "She's here. She's on the Titanic," he says. The interlocutor looks scared and confused, but the journalist confirms the sarcophagus is here. He doesn't doubt it because he saw it with his own eyes. After dinner, they go to their cabins. The journalist lies down but can't help thinking about the mummy. He tries to convince himself that everything he has found out about the priestess is a myth. There is no curse. The moment he finally falls asleep, he feels a slight push. A few minutes later, a crew member knocks on his cabin door. He informs that all passengers must go to the upper deck because something has happened to the ship. The journalist goes out into the fresh air and sees a huge crowd of people. There's no panic yet. Someone says that something has happened to the engine. Others say it's just a precaution. The journalist immediately understands everything. The ship is sinking. The priestess did it. In less than an hour, the Titanic completely went underwater. One legend says the priestess influenced the captain of the ship. The crew members didn't dare to put such a valuable cargo in the hold. Therefore, they placed the box with the artifact near the captain's bridge. On that fateful night, the captain decided to look at the casket with his own eyes. After that, his behavior became weird. They said the spirit clouded his mind. When the ship entered the territory filled with icebergs, he refused to slow down, despite the requests of the crew. The sarcophagus may still lie at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean even now, with the priestess finally having found her peace. Okay, this story is nothing more than a legend. There's no record or evidence that the Titanic was carrying any kind of mummy or sarcophagus. The legend appeared a couple of years after the disaster. At that time, there were many theories about what happened to the Titanic. The ship sank because of secret agencies. ETs attacked the Titanic. The Titanic was sunk specifically to get money for the insurance company. Such crazy theories were very popular among audiences. One of these theories was developed by a well-known newspaper. Journalists published an article about the cursed mummy on board the Titanic. The rest picked up the legend, and it became popular. One of the reasons why people believe in such things is hidden in human psychology. Any fake legend tells something secret, things that people don't or shouldn't know about. When a person reads this, they feel special because now they know a terrible secret. This sense of self-importance is the reason for the popularity of conspiracy theories. Well, it is also important to note that all these theories are really interesting. By the way, the mummy from this story actually exists, and it's in the British Museum. More precisely, there's only a wooden lid from the sarcophagus with the image of a woman. It's still unknown who it belonged to. The identity of the last owner is also unknown. It's only known the exhibit was transferred to the museum at the end of the 19th century. There, she was called the Unlucky Mummy. The museum staff reports that it doesn't bring any misfortunes. The screams and knocking from the lid are just a myth. You can come and see the exhibit yourself with your own eyes, if you dare, of course. On April 10, 1912, crowds gathered at Southampton Beach to wave off what was, at the time, the world's largest and most prestigious ship, the RMS Titanic. The cost of the most expensive first-class parlor ticket was $4,350. That's around $70,000 in today's money. But barely 5 days after steaming away, the ship was swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean. So let's rewind and go back to what actually happened on that fateful night. The captain wanted to set a speed record for the ship's maiden voyage and arrive early. The ship was deemed unsinkable, so he went full throttle into the dark Arctic waters. After spotting the 100-foot iceberg, the crew desperately tried to steer the vessel away and avoid the collision, but the Titanic was traveling too fast, and the iceberg tore down the side of the ship, creating a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. In total, the damage spanned along an area of around 300 feet. But the ship's designers had prepared for the prospect of a collision and added watertight compartments down each side of the ship to act as a buffer zone. 4 of these compartments could be breached and the ship would still stay afloat. But because the iceberg tore down the side of the Titanic, it ripped holes in 6 compartments. The compartments didn't extend up the total height of all decks and weren't actually sealed at the top. This is why, when more than 4 were flooded, water reached over the top of the bulkheads and filled the remaining compartments, causing the ship to sink into the ocean. Think of it as water spilling over an ice cube tray. But what if the collision was head-on? Would it still have sunk? Ships are designed with potential crashes in mind, and most vessels have collision bulkheads in the bow. Most of all, it's like your car's bumper or crumple zone. It's a safety feature that can withstand a direct hit. The bow could have taken some of the impact, and some experts have suggested that if it hit head-on, only 2 to 4 of the watertight compartments would have been flooded. So, in theory, the Titanic might not have sunk, and it might have even been able to continue sailing to its final destination at a much slower speed. The force of impact would likely have been huge, though. But although passengers would have been injured by the force, they'd have been able to stay on the ship to wait to be rescued by other ships, rather than being forced into the icy waters of the Atlantic. Still, one of the Titanic's designers, Edward Wilding, suggested that the force of the impact might not have actually been that big. He told the British Inquiry that lots of people scarcely felt the collision, and he believed the ship would not have sunk if it did hit the iceberg head-on. The ship was also designed with remotely operated watertight doors between all compartments, so any floods could have been quickly sorted out. Because Titanic had 6 breaches from the side collision, and because it happened so quickly, sealing the doors wouldn't have made a difference, as it was essentially impossible to save it by that point. The ship immediately began to flood, with water pouring in at a rate of roughly 7 tons per second, 15 times faster than it could be pumped out. So, while it sounds like the Titanic would have survived had the ship hit the iceberg head-on, this idea does come with some issues. First off, the collision bulkheads were designed to survive a crash with another ship, not a giant iceberg. If 2 ships collided, both would absorb some of the impact in their bulkheads, sharing the impact and likely staying afloat. But an iceberg is stationary, meaning that Titanic would absorb most of the energy from the collision. If Titanic hit head first, because of the speed it was traveling, the impact would have likely traveled down the whole body of the ship. Just imagine a 46,000-ton ship traveling at around 20 knots. At some point, it hits an iceberg that weighs what could be over 100,000 tons. This collision would likely create a powerful force causing massive damage to the vessel. It is likely that seams would split, staircases would come tumbling down, and rivets would burst open across the ship. All that would have potentially flooded even more compartments. This could have caused Titanic to sink in a matter of minutes rather than hours. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. As we all know, the biggest part of it is hidden underwater. So if Titanic had been traveling head-on, it's likely it would have hit the part of the iceberg below the water first, which would send it veering off course. Hitting an iceberg is not like hitting a brick wall. In this case, the ice under the water would have torn open the bottom of the ship and caused damage to the sides. Icebergs also aren't flat, solid objects. If a flat collision happened, the ship might have stayed afloat, but icebergs come in many shapes and sizes, from domes to wedges. Studies have also been done on the steel used to produce Titanic, and the tests show the metal was about 10 times more brittle than the steel we use today. The ship was built before we understood the effects of low temperature on steel. The old steel used to make the vessel would not bend when faced with freezing temperatures, but break. Recovered pieces of Titanic's hull plates show that the hull just shattered on impact. Hitting head-on would also cause a very severe and abrupt stop, so even if the ship hadn't sunk, there would still have been major issues. Think about when you suddenly hit the brakes on your car, or when the bus stops while you're walking down the aisle and you get flung forward. Passengers would have been thrown across the ship, and because the crash happened at night, most people were sleeping, so wouldn't be able to effectively prepare for any sort of impact. This would result in injuries for most people on board. It would be especially bad for those at the front of the ship, where the accommodation for the off-duty firefighters, greasers, and engineers was. But while passengers and off-duty crew may have been thrown out of bed, there would be a lot more survivors than in the original scenario. Many ships have had head-on collisions and made it back to shore. Not many people know that Titanic actually had 2 sister ships. The White Star Line, the company that built Titanic, also built vessels called Britannic and Olympic. Captained by Edward J. Smith, who would later helm Titanic, the Olympic set off on its maiden voyage in June 1911. But much like Ford's sister ship, disaster was just around the corner. On its 5th commercial voyage, Olympic collided with a Royal Navy ship, HMS Hawke. While the Olympic received damage to its side, Hawke crashed into the other vessel head-on. The bow of the Hawke was completely crushed by the collision, but because the ship had watertight compartments, it managed to survive the impact and later returned to shore for repair. Another study case is the SS Andrea Doria, which was an Italian ocean liner that made global headlines in 1956. Like the Titanic, the Andrea Doria was heading for New York City on its 101st voyage when disaster struck. On July 25th, the vessel collided with the 524-foot Swedish passenger liner Stockholm. The Stockholm hit the ship head-on, but the point of impact for the Andrea Doria was on its side. The front of the Stockholm was completely smashed, but because the impact was on its hull, it managed to survive. The Andrea Doria, however, sadly sank due to the collision being on the side of the ship. So these cases could suggest that maybe the Titanic would have survived had it hit the iceberg head-on. But we have to remember that the Titanic hit the thing full speed, whereas both the Olympic and the Andrea Doria were traveling slower.
The cause of the Titanic crash was an iceberg, or so we've always been told. But new research has come to light that debunks this theory. On April 15, 1915, Titanic, the biggest ship of its time, completely disappeared under the ice-cold surface of the Atlantic Ocean. It's hard to believe that such a massive and expensive creation could be destroyed by one simple iceberg, right? Well, recent findings suggest that the real cause of the disaster was a fire, not an iceberg. For over 3 decades, journalist Senan Maloney has dedicated himself to studying the sinking of the Titanic. During his research, he made a significant discovery that shed new light on the well-known story. Maloney discovered a massive black spot on the hull of the Titanic, which measured an impressive 30 feet in length. He found it thanks to an unpublished album of photographs that showcased the construction and preparation of the ill-fated ship's first and final journey. Can you believe that most probably the fire on the Titanic had been burning at extreme temperatures for 3 whole weeks before anyone noticed it? Crazy, right? Apparently the high temperature corrupted the metal, making it 75% weaker. That's why the iceberg was able to make a hole in the ship. If not for the fire, the Titanic might have survived the crash because the iceberg apparently hit the exact spot we are talking about. And this is only one link in the chain of incredible coincidences that brought the Titanic down. The people in charge of the Titanic knew about the fire and knew the ship shouldn't have set sail. But they didn't want to go bankrupt and cancel the trip, especially since there was a coal shortage due to miners being on strike. The trip was already sold out, and there were no alternatives. Other ships canceled their trips due to low demand. Everyone wanted to board the Titanic, so the management bought up all the coal they could find, even from other ships, and set off. It was all about making money. To hide the truth, they turned the ship's hull so that the marks weren't visible from the dock and faced the sea. This way, the passengers wouldn't see them. Here's another sad twist in the Titanic's story. Back then, there weren't any sonar systems to detect danger, so specially trained people had to watch out for threats using binoculars. But the binoculars on the Titanic were locked away in a special compartment, and the only person with the key, Second Officer David Blair, was replaced last minute before the ship took off. He forgot to hand the key over to his replacement. This mistake wasn't discovered until 3 days later when the ship was already at sea. If they had the binoculars, they might have seen the iceberg in time and avoided the crash. But even if they had the binoculars, they might not have been able to avoid the crash because the Titanic was going faster than it was supposed to. They were behind schedule and didn't want to ruin the ship's reputation, so they were going way beyond the speed limits the ship's construction could sustain. One of the biggest mistakes made on the Titanic was the decision to not include enough lifeboats. Even though the ship needed around 60 of them to contain all the passengers, it was only equipped with 20. The designer, Alexander Carlisle, had initially planned for 48 lifeboats, but this number was reduced for aesthetic purposes. Apparently, having too many lifeboats would have made the deck look too cluttered. These 20 boats were only able to hold a third of the passengers on board, which was not nearly enough to save everyone in the event of an emergency. What's even more shocking is that this number of lifeboats was technically legal at the time. Regulations for lifeboats were based on the tonnage of the ship, not the number of passengers. This means that even though the Titanic was carrying thousands of people, it still met the legal requirements for lifeboat capacity. Another serious mistake made by the crew was the decision to cancel the lifeboat drill scheduled for the day of the disaster. Lifeboat drills were standard practice on ocean liners at the time, but for no apparent reason, Captain Edward John Smith chose to cancel it. This meant that passengers were not prepared for an emergency, and the crew was not adequately trained to handle the situation. When the ship hit the iceberg, chaos ensued, and it took over half an hour to launch the lifeboats instead of the usual 10 minutes. Some folks put the blame on Captain Smith for the fact that the first set of lifeboats left partially empty. The very first lifeboat, which had seats for 65 people, only carried 27 passengers. There is an objective reason for this. At the beginning, people were reluctant to abandon the ship and didn't understand the gravity of their situation. In 2012, researchers uncovered that Captain Smith failed his initial navigation exam. Although he eventually passed, some people wonder if this could have played a role in the disaster. During the Titanic's final moments, the crew attempted to send out distress signals to nearby ships, including the Californian. However, the Californian failed to respond to the flares shot into the sky, and the captain ultimately lost his job as a result of this negligence. However, recent research has exonerated the captain and proved his innocence. It turns out that light refraction, caused by layers of cold air below warmer air, created mirages that distorted the signals from the Titanic. This phenomenon had been observed by other ships sailing in the area and is now believed to be the reason why the lookouts on the Titanic missed the iceberg completely. Historian Tim Malton supports this theory and has further contributed to our understanding of this event. It's unfortunate that the captain of the Californian lost his job due to circumstances beyond his control, but it's better late than never that his reputation is cleared. Whatever the reason for Titanic's crash was, it still keeps the minds of scientists busy to this day. But let's see what the buzz was all about. What made the Titanic so famous and unique? The Titanic was massive, standing at 175 feet tall and nearly 900 feet long. The ship was so enormous that even the officers took over 2 weeks to memorize all the decks and passageways. You could be walking miles along its corridors. The construction cost of the ship was a whopping $7,500,000, which would be equivalent to about $166 million in the mid-2010 ES, due to inflation. Interestingly, the production cost of the Titanic movie in 1997 was even higher at $200 million. Building the Titanic was no small feat, and it required a labor force of 3,000 men who worked 6 days a week for 26 months. The job was difficult and dangerous, and workers had to complete tasks at the height of a 20-story building without safety ropes. Nevertheless, they were paid a competitive wage of £2 a week, which was considered good pay at the time. The inside of the Titanic was inspired by the luxurious Ritz Hotel in London. The most impressive feature of the ship's interior was the grand staircase, which extended through 7 of the ship's 10 decks. The staircase was adorned with ornate paintings, bronze cherubs, and oak paneling. The first-class passengers had access to an impressive array of facilities, including a heated swimming pool, Turkish bath, gym, squash court, beauty salon, and even a stylist to help them prepare for dinner. First-class passengers on the Titanic were pampered to an extraordinary extent. They had their own onboard newspaper, the Atlantic Daily Bulletin, and even their dogs were taken care of with a special area where they could be fed, walked, and trained during the voyage. The first-class meals were a grand affair, with 13 courses and a different wine for each course. These dinners could last up to 5 hours, and they were certainly something to look forward to. With such opulence and luxury on board, it's not surprising that so many people were eager to take the first trip on the Titanic.
It's April 10th, 1912, a sunny spring day. You're one of the first-class passengers aboard the Titanic, just as the ship is about to depart from Southampton. Imagine everyone's excitement, fresh spring air, the sounds of the sea. You're strolling along the highest deck of the Titanic when you notice several lifeboats. As you start counting the boats, you recall the ship's capacity. It's just over 3,000 people. Wait, but are there enough lifeboats for everyone aboard? Let's look into the numbers. The Titanic could carry a needed total of 64 lifeboats, a number which could have easily helped to save all the passengers on board. Chief designer Alexander Carlisle planned to equip the ship with 48 lifeboats, but the Titanic ended up with a mere 20. The fact that this number of lifeboats wasn't enough for all the passengers was not illegal at the time. This was because the number of lifeboats required was calculated based on the tonnage of a ship, not her passenger capacity. Speaking of the Titanic, This number of boats was chosen for aesthetic reasons, to make the decks look less crowded to the ship's elite and high-class passengers. After the final decision on the lifeboats was taken, Carlyle quit his job. Passengers' strolls on the Titanic's decks were pleasing to the eye, but were they worth it in the end? In 2012, a century after the wreck, new documents related to the scandalous lack of lifeboats were uncovered. It appears that a safety inspector named Maurice Clark proposed the addition of at least 10 more lifeboats, 5 hours before the ship was supposed to set sail. But since the ship's owners clearly wanted to leave on time, his plea was overlooked. He was also warned that unless he kept this secret, he would be fired. In retrospect, had the owners followed his advice, an estimated 700 more people might have survived that night. The 20 lifeboats you counted, those that actually made it on board, could have carried only a third of the passengers, even at their full capacity. But tragically, some of them were launched with as few as 12 people, when they could have easily saved up to 65 people each. To add to the disaster, the Titanic's crew members were not properly trained on using the lifeboat launching equipment. That's why the boats were launched slowly, improperly, and sometimes without the right supervision. Out of the 20 lifeboats, only 18 were set afloat correctly. Also, passengers were not informed about safety measures. A lifeboat drill should have taken place on the 14th of April, but the captain eventually canceled the event. One of the many myths surrounding the Titanic and its catastrophic ending is also related to the lack of the necessary number of lifeboats. There was no maritime law at the time that said women and children should get into lifeboats first. But it was a universally accepted custom in such types of situations as a shipwreck. Shortly after the Titanic had sunk in the icy Atlantic waters, rumors started to spread. It was said that some desperate men had resorted to dressing up as women in those final moments before midnight on April 14, 1912. They wanted to get a spot on the lifeboats and have a chance to save their lives. At the same time, there's little to no evidence that any of the male passengers of the Titanic had actually done this. In any case, what happened to those 20 lifeboats that were on board the Titanic after the ship hit the iceberg? What we do know is that all these boats were launched between 12:40 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., with a total of 718 people on board. By the time they were rescued by the RMS Carpathia at about 4 a.m. the same day, only 705 people had remained alive. It took the crew of the RMS Carpathia more than 4 hours and 30 minutes to pick up all the passengers and 13 of the lifeboats. This was as many as the rescue ship was allowed to carry. The rest of the now empty lifeboats were left adrift at sea. Those salvaged were later given back to the White Star Line, the British shipping company which operated the Titanic. Strangely, after being returned, they appeared to have vanished from official records. The last image ever taken of the 13 surviving lifeboats was of them getting unloaded in the New York harbor. Sadly and ironically, that's where the Titanic was supposed to be on April 18, 1912. The lifeboats were then rid of their Titanic nameplates or any other markings that could have linked them to the ship. Some sources claim that the boats were eventually destroyed. But was this actually the truth? The fate of one particular lifeboat has been the source of much debate. Collapsible Boat A, the last one to leave the ship, was retrieved by the RMS Oceanic a month after the crash. At that time, it was a shocking 200 miles away from the spot where the Titanic had sunk. Also, in the boat, there was a wedding band engraved with the words "Edward to Gerda," a sad omen to a couple that were lost at sea after managing to escape the sinking Titanic. Later identified as Edward and Gerda Lindell, the couple was traveling from Sweden to the U.S. to relocate. Some accounts claimed that Mr. Lindell did, in fact, make it to Collapsible Boat A, but his wife wasn't as lucky. Neither were ever seen again, and the wedding band was eventually sent to Gerda's father. The recovery of Collapsible Boat A was recorded in both photographs taken by the crew on board the RMS Oceanic and by a detailed handwritten account of a fellow passenger. They claimed that the lifeboat had looked more like a piece of wood carried by the waves than an actual boat. The first lifeboat to depart from the Titanic was Lifeboat number 7. It was dubbed the Millionaire Lifeboat. It's rumored that the 12 passengers on board might have bribed the crew to row away to safety instead of allowing others to jump in. In 2015, some of the items recovered from this lifeboat, including a lunch menu, a ticket, and a letter from one of the passengers, were auctioned for up to $70,000 by a New York auctioneer. Soon after the Titanic catastrophe, it became mandatory for all ships to be equipped with enough lifeboats to carry all the passengers and crew. It's more likely that the Titanic lifeboats, being relatively new equipment at the time, were refitted to be used on other ships, such as the RMS Olympic, which was the Titanic's older sister. Some of them may have been sold off to private collections, or even left to rot. After all, they were seen as a source of bad luck, and most people were unwilling to use them again on other ships. Unfortunately, all the information about their whereabouts is hard to confirm now. No official statement from the owners of the lifeboats was ever given after their rescue. But although nothing appears to have remained of the original lifeboats, some full-sized replicas exist on display in museums in Falmouth, England, and Belfast, Northern Ireland. One of the few surviving White Star Line lifeboats did not, in fact, belong to the Titanic, but it did have a striking connection to the cursed ship. This boat is the restored Lifeboat 6 from the RMS Oceanic, which helped to recover Titanic's collapsible Lifeboat C. It was said to be owned by a private collector, but similar to the Titanic's lifeboats, we don't know anything about its location today. As for the nameplates and other identification marks of the lifeboats, the White Star Line seems to have kept them. Because some of these items were later auctioned and sold to interested collectors, even Rick Springfield supposedly got hold of one of the nameplates. One particular nameplate was already missing by the time the White Star Line employees had reached the lifeboats. It was the nameplate of Lifeboat Number 8, which had been taken by a sailor named Thomas Jones. He later gifted it to another Titanic survivor, the Countess of Rothes, along with a letter acknowledging the bond they formed on the night of the shipwreck. You can find other similar items on display in different museums, such as Larne Museum and Arts Centre in Northern Ireland, or Worcester City Art Gallery and Museum. To be fair, some experts claim that even if there had been more lifeboats on board the Titanic, there simply might not have been enough time to launch them all. That's how severe the impact was. Many researchers say that everything was happening so rapidly after the ship had hit the iceberg that it's astonishing that so many passengers managed to survive.
In the Titanic movie, you won't see any fumes above the fourth funnel of the legendary ocean liner, and it's not a mistake. Back in 1911, the year before the Dream ship's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the fourth was added for balance and more impressive looks. The White Star Line thought the public would have been disappointed to see only 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The Titanic's sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, also had 1 fake funnel each for the same reason. The dummy chimney wasn't completely useless and served for ventilation. It took out the fumes from the machine spaces in the lower decks and from one of the first-class general rooms. 1 big ventilation funnel, instead of several small ones, helped to declutter the upper decks and left more open space for passengers to enjoy their strolls. When Titanic went down, the funnels, each weighing 60 tons, went down with the rest of the ship. They were made extra tall to make sure the passengers weren't covered in the suit being ejected. Their height and weight let them stay in the upright position. The forward funnel, followed by the others, fell only when the ship went for the final dive. Those chimneys were much lighter than the bow, so they spread among other debris. The light material they were made of flattened once it hit the bottom, and the iron-eating bacteria living deep down took care of it later. The bow of Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled. When the famous ocean liner hit that iceberg, things got really messy. It took the future movie star a whole 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, The damaged compartments were spilling water into others, and it was chaos because these compartments were only watertight horizontally. Soon enough, water started flooding through the anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking, and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went underwater, and the stern shot up almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china or falling gear. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing almost 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. The bow was cruising down at about 13 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost a half an hour before the stern. The two parts of the Titanic now lie 2,000 feet apart, pointing in different directions. The bow remained mostly intact, just covered in mud. The stern turned into a tangled wreck because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Signal rockets played a big part in the Titanic's tragedy. When a ship goes down, you're supposed to shoot up red flares to signal trouble. But someone decided to stock Titanic with white lights instead of the usual red ones. So when the ship smacked into that iceberg, the crew fired off white flares. The SS Californian was passing nearby, and its captain knew the Titanic was in a dangerous iceberg zone. The crew didn't spot the sinking Titanic, but they sure saw those white rockets. The radio between the ships was useless because the Californian's operator switched it off. The captain had a gut feeling something was off, so he flashed a Morse code light signal at Titanic. But he received no reply because the Titanic had already gone underwater. There was another ship, Samson, sailing alongside the Titanic. It had plenty of illegally hunted frozen seal meat from Canadian waters abroad, so it was sailing with lights off to remain unnoticed. When they saw the Titanic's white rockets, they thought it was the Coast Guard and zoomed away. Samson didn't have a radio, so they couldn't find out about the ongoing disaster. The crew got the news about Titanic only when they got to the coast of Iceland the following month. There have been many theories to explain the Titanic tragedy, and one of the recent ones says that there was a fire involved. An Irish journalist went full detective for decades, digging into the mystery, and stumbled upon a game-changer. He came across a photo album that had been hiding from the public for a century after the tragedy. In the pictures, taken at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just over a week before the liner sailed, you can clearly see a massive 30-foot black spot on the ship's hull. Maloney researched the photos and eyewitness testimony from the time and claimed that a fire spontaneously broke out inside of one of Titanic's enormous coal bunkers. It was raging for a whole 3 weeks and messed with the metal, critically weakening a crucial segment of the ship's hull. Back then, most ships had just one hull, so it was the only skin the Titanic had. That's why the Iceberg managed to punch a hole through the ship so easily. If it hadn't been for the fire, the Titanic might have shrugged off that iceberg collision. The company operating the liner knew about the fire, but they decided to conceal that fact. They didn't want any negative stories in the press as they faced some serious competition in transatlantic voyages. The Titanic was sold out, so they stocked up on coal and made it sail. The moon might have also played a role in the sinking. Our satellite heavily affects tides on the Earth. The closer it is to our planet, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of the moon. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide. During new and full moons, the alignment of the moon, the Earth, and the Sun makes their combined gravity reach its peak. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the Sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. It created the perfect conditions for the icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers to move freely. Opponents of this theory say that the difference in tidal force wasn't actually that big, and it couldn't have been the main cause of the sinking. The iceberg tore down the side of the ship, leaving a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. Some experts believe the ship would have survived the iceberg if it had hit head-on. The Titanic had watertight compartments designed to prevent flooding in case of a collision. Only the first 3 or 4 of these compartments would have been flooded. This could have helped save a lot of lives. Supporters of this theory put the blame for the disaster on First Officer William Murdoch. Huge, fast-moving ships don't just turn in a matter of seconds like a speeding car. It takes minutes. When Murdoch realized the collision was inevitable, he tried dodging left to avoid a direct hit. But despite his efforts, the ship still collided with the iceberg. You know the rest. No one could ever have imagined that the unsinkable Titanic would collide with an iceberg, except for one man, William Thomas Stead. Well, not directly, of course. It's not like he jolted out of bed one day, envisioning the fall of the Titanic. Rather, he wrote an empowering short story called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor on March 3, 1886, 26 years before Titanic sank. Okay, let's do a super quick recap. Titanic was traveling from Southampton to New York in April 1912 in the North Atlantic. The ship hit an iceberg, and less than 3 hours later, it was completely underwater. Out of 2,208 people on board, just 706 survived due to the limited number of lifeboats and icy cold water. Another passenger ship, Carpathia, heard the distress call, picked up the survivors, and brought them safely to New York. The short story William Stead wrote was about Thomas, a British sailor, who got on a passenger liner bound for the U.S. At one point, the protagonist realized there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board the ship in case something happened. A couple of days later, heavy fog covered everything in sight. Luck was not on the liner's side, and it collided with a stray ship, just like Titanic struck an iceberg. Only 200 out of the 916 people made it safely to the U.S. The main character managed to survive by jumping into the water and climbing into one of the lifeboats. Now, you'd think that the story riled up everyone in the industry to add extra lifeboats on ships. But sadly, it received very little attention when it was published. Even more tragically, William Thomas Stead was on Titanic when it sank, and he didn't make it. The survivors who knew Stead mentioned that he had always been cheerful and had loved to chat during meals. He complimented the ship's design and how sturdy it was. Witnesses also talked about how he had been helpful when the ship had been sinking, having given his life jacket to someone else. He was a journalist by profession and was on his way to New York for a ceremony. One of his most important contributions to modern journalism was the use of illustrations in every newspaper article. He also introduced newspaper interviews, and they're still used to this day along with illustrations. But this story wasn't the only published work that predicted the disaster. Morgan Robertson was an author and former ship captain who wrote short stories and novels. His most notable novella is The Wreck of the Titan. It's also known as Futility. The book was written in 1898, 14 years before Titanic. It was a fictional story about the Titan, an ocean liner similar to Titanic, which was crossing the North Atlantic. It's also a coincidence that Titan was just as fast as Titanic and shared many other similarities, like size and design. The book described it as unsinkable and the largest ship to hit the ocean at the time. That's what they said about Titanic, too. Another eerie similarity was the limited number of lifeboats it had. The story took place in April, and that's when Titanic set off on its journey and hit the iceberg. The Titan story also mentioned that barely anyone had survived that horrible accident. Unlike Stead's story, the protagonist of Robertson took a different path. The Titan sinking happened somewhere halfway through the book, so after the accident, the main character went on with his life. The book was brought back into the spotlight after the Titanic disaster. How could someone describe the events that took place almost a decade later so accurately? Many started to believe Robertson could see the future. But the reality was that Robertson knew his way around a ship. It was easy for him to write down the nitty-gritty of things without doing more research. Realistically, one of the biggest threats for ships at that time was hitting an iceberg or colliding with other ships. The next story sounds somewhat mysterious. Once, Alex Mackenzie heard a voice that warned him not to board Titanic. But when he turned around, there was nobody there. As he continued walking, the voice spoke to him again. But this time, it was louder and more distinct. He took the warning seriously and decided to cancel the trip and go back to Glasgow, Scotland, his hometown. His grandparents weren't too happy to find him back home instead of on Titanic. After all, the ticket was very expensive. That disappointment very soon disappeared when they heard that the ship had struck an iceberg. John Coffey was a member of the crew of Titanic, but he decided to ditch the ride when the ship stopped at his hometown in Queenstown, Ireland. His inner voice told him to get off the liner, and he did. He was only 23 at the time, and for someone his age, it could be a major career boost and an opportunity to grow. Despite the horrible tragedy, the guy signed to work with the RMS Mauritania just months after the Titanic sinking. Talk about commitment. Some added info was revealed about what may have contributed to the fall of Titanic. The constructors insisted that the ship was unsinkable, but many people later theorized that the vessel's steel plates had been too frail for the freezing Atlantic water. It may have caused the rivets to pop, allowing ocean water to seep inside. Another theory is that there may have been a fire in the hull of the Titanic that had been raging for 3 weeks before the voyage. The fire softened the steel, allowing the iceberg to cut through it like a hot knife through butter. Some pictures before the ship set off on its journey show black marks on the hull, which could have been caused by fire. Either way, the iceberg would have caused significant damage in any case, no matter if there was a fire or not. Some people also blame those who designed the Titanic. The ship was built with large joints at the bottom, which probably snapped easily during the collision. Of course, these are all theories, but we know for a fact that the iceberg was the main character of this drama, and that the works of Stead and Robertson should have been taken seriously. Either way, this should be a lesson for the future, helping to prevent similar tragic accidents. By the way, ocean liners and passenger ships wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Thomas Newcomen. In 1712, he invented a steam engine that was so strong it could produce enough energy to power a ship. And a century later, in 1819, the first steamship traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool, UK. It only took the vessel 29 days to cross the ocean. The passenger ship industry boomed in the early 1900s when it became easier for people to move to America or go on holidays. As decades rolled by, the use of aircraft stole the spotlight from passenger ships since planes were faster and more efficient. Nowadays, it's quite rare for a passenger ship to collide with anything in open water. Modern technologies can detect anything that can pose a threat and even predict stormy weather. Cruise ships these days are giants compared to the vessels of Titanic's era. Modern ships can carry almost twice the number of passengers and have amenities folks back then could only dream of. Most cruise ships these days have several restaurants to choose from, multiple swimming pools, and game rooms to catch a break. If you're in the mood for some fun, you can watch live performances. Don't forget about the helicopter pad, because why not? Don't worry if you start feeling unwell. The in-house doctors are always there to help any passenger in need. And these ships are only going to get bigger. Putting Titanic and a modern cruise ship side by side is like comparing a Corgi to a Doberman. Back then, Titanic was the biggest and most cutting-edge vessel anyone could dream of. So, who knows what the future of cruise ships can hold? We might even have entire cities floating around. That would be a really big boat. Titanic sank on April 14, 1912, and all of the passengers' belongings and ship's paraphernalia went down into the deep, dark waters with it. These objects patiently waited to be discovered until 1985. Titanic sank fast, and there seemed to be almost nothing left from the ship. Yet divers in small submarines managed to retrieve plenty of artifacts from the wreckage. If you wonder what those surprising items look like, hey, join me. A number of museums have collections of Titanic items rescued by divers or donated by survivors and their relatives. And some of those items are even sold at auction. So if you're ready to spend a pretty penny on an exclusive artifact, hey, why not? The first artifact on my list is a pocket watch belonging to a Titanic passenger, John Chapman. John and his wife Elizabeth were on their honeymoon. When the ship hit the iceberg, Elizabeth was offered a seat on a lifeboat next to her friend Emily Richards. There was a problem though. Mr. Chapman couldn't enter the lifeboat. Elizabeth turned to her friend Emily and said, "Farewell, if John can't go, I won't go either." Now, that's what I call true love. After a short time, the ship went under. If we step back and return to Chapman's pocket watch, we'll notice one more heartbreaking detail. Experts believe the watch stopped around the time the ship finally submerged. Do you remember the iconic scene in the Titanic movie where the ship's band continued to play while the ship was sinking? The violin, played by the real musician, was sold in an auction for $1.7 million in 2013. They say the band played Nearer My God to Thee as the ocean liner sank. Since we started talking about the band, we might as well shed light on a piece of music found on the ship. It was the song Put Your Arms Around Me, Honey. Considering the fact that paper gets ruined almost instantly when it meets with water, it's a miracle to see those documents. Another saved paper document is the lunch menu. The first-class passengers wore their beautiful dresses and enjoyed their meals without knowing that it was their last lunch. This unique item was auctioned for $122,000. Meals were offered based on class. For instance, a first-class passenger would eat roasted turkey with cranberry sauce, spring lamb, or baked haddock. In comparison, a third-class lunch consists of stuff like rice soup, fresh bread, roast beef, and brown gravy. There were also cabin biscuits, which the passengers would eat to diminish seasickness. It wasn't just the menu. A VIP ticket was also retrieved. The ticket number is still readable, 1342. Number 5 is Edwardian perfume samples. A chemist named Adolf Saalfeld stepped onto the Titanic with various perfume bottle samples. Why did he bring these samples with him? Well, Saalfeld planned to open a fragrance store in America. 61 vials of perfume sank with the ship. Luckily, their owner managed to survive and get there safely, but his samples sank and were only rediscovered some time ago by the divers. When we accidentally drop a plate, it usually shatters into pieces. Now, there's a question. Do you think an unbroken plate can be recovered from Titanic? The answer is yes. Original White Star tableware is proof. Apparently, each class of passengers didn't just get different meals, but was also served with different types of plates. The retrieved plates have a green and brown floral motif. The edges have a gold rim, and there's a logo in the center. By the way, they're sold at auction, and you can find them online. Let's carry on with touching personal stories. The love story of Rose and Jack that we see in the movie is fictional, but the ship surely witnessed many romantic tales. Here's a love letter to prove this. The messages tell us a story about how life was on the ship during the last few days. It was written by Kate Buss on April 10th. She mentioned how seasick she felt and other things, such as she was supposed to go to dinner in a half an hour. This letter wasn't the only letter divers took to the surface. For example, there's the letter Esther Hart wrote to her little daughter Ava. It was sold at auction for £119,000. This letter is probably the last letter written on board, since it was completed only 8 hours before the tragedy. The letter is not that damaged because it was in the pocket of Esther's husband's coat. Another letter we can mention is Dr. John Simpson's letter. Those words were the last words that he wrote to his mother. Let me introduce you to Edith Rosenbaum. She was on the ship with her lucky toy pig. Edith had been severely injured in an accident before she sailed on the big ship. The toy was a present from her mother as moral support for her recuperation process. It was actually a music box in the shape of a pig. Edith used it to calm frightened young people in the same lifeboat. The next item on the list is the scout whistle of Lillian Winifred Bentham. She was a second-class passenger. On that terrible night, Lillian was in her stateroom. She didn't believe that the Titanic could sink. After all, it was the unsinkable ship. Her friend came to her and convinced her to hop into a lifeboat. Only then did she realize how serious the situation was. Moments later, she saw the ship break into two parts. As the lifeboat floated into the night, Lillian saw a crewman who was also rescued. Without a second thought, she wrapped the man with her fur coat. It was freezing, so she probably saved the man's life by doing that. The young man wanted to thank her for her kindness, so he gave Lillian a scout whistle. It was the whistle he used throughout the night to call for help. This pair of white gloves is one of the rarest artifacts recovered from Titanic. These cotton gloves belong to a gentleman. The owner's identity is unknown. Fabric can't last underwater for decades, but these gloves look fine, and you can still see the fine detailing and elegance. An alarm bell has also been found. Yes, that's the famous bell, the one that rang to warn people about the iceberg. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were on lookout duty the night of the accident. Both of them survived. Fleet was the one who saw the iceberg before the ship struck it. What's ironic is that Fleet and Lee didn't have access to binoculars. They were stored in a locker in the crow's nest, but the key to the locker was in the pocket of a crew member who was reassigned to another ship at the last minute and didn't leave the key. They could have seen the iceberg sooner if they had had pairs of binoculars. If they had had it, the Titanic could have gotten out of the way. Divers discovered not just belongings of passengers or the crew, but also pieces belonging to the ship itself. Our next artifact is the Grand Staircase. Some parts of this iconic structure are recovered from the wreck. Turns out that this staircase became a meeting spot among first-class passengers. If they wanted to visit the Turkish baths for a spa day or eat dinner, they met at the staircase and went together. This staircase was a sign of how luxurious some parts of Titanic were. Another miraculously saved object that belongs to the ship is its plan. It was one of the most expensive artifacts sold at auction. The plan is around 30 feet wide. What else? The logometer was also discovered. It's a device used to check the sailing speed of the ship and the distance it covers. The experts say that from the start at noon on April 14th, the device logged 268 nautical miles. And there's more. A giant chunk of hull, known as the Big Piece, was also found. This fellow weighs 15 tons. The larger portholes were for the cabins, and the smaller ones were for the restrooms. This piece was found in 1994, but it was in 1998 when it was successfully taken out. After all these years spent underwater, it was swarming with sea life. Still surprisingly, the portholes still had glass. Now, let's assume you were a diver and you could only take out one of these objects. Which one would you pick? It was 11:39 at night when the Titanic's lookout shouted, "Iceberg, right ahead!" Swift action on the bridge to reduce speed and change the ship's course didn't help, and you already know how the story ends. Since then, we've regarded what happened to Titanic as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Is it though? The Titanic sank in 1912. Forget about fancy GPSs or weather satellites. At the time, ships were responsible for warning each other about the location of icebergs, like a "hey man, trust me on this" situation. Then the Titanic disaster happened. To call it a disaster is an understatement, so specialists felt the need to form an organization to avoid this kind of accident happening again. That's why, a year later, they created the International Ice Patrol, or IIP for short. Up to this day, this group has been responsible for giving ships advanced warnings about ice threats. IIP improved their methods over the years, from ship reports and aircraft patrols to satellite images. Recently, they've also been using oceanographic buoys, floating devices providing real-time information about ocean conditions up to 164 feet below the surface to predict the potential drift of icebergs. Luckily, IIP is doing an excellent job in reducing ship iceberg collisions. But don't get too comfortable, because even the most advanced detection equipment can't entirely avoid an unfortunate situation. Between 1980 and 2005, there were 57 incidents involving vessels and icebergs. And the chilling truth is that today's ships are more likely to run into an iceberg than the Titanic was. Studies have shown that 1,038 icebergs crossed the area where the Titanic sank back in 1912. You might think that's a lot, but scientists say it's not really a big deal. I mean, yeah, it's on the higher side, but there have been 14 years with even more iceberg activity since then. Nowadays, the number of icebergs is going up due to the accelerated melting of Greenland's glaciers. And since more ships are heading into polar waters, the chances of ships bumping into icebergs are higher. But the real danger for captains is invisible enemies, called growlers and bergy bits. Growlers are these small icebergs that can be the size of a regular door. And bergy bits are also considered small, measuring around the size of a school bus. These icebergs might seem harmless, but they're actually tricky since they can be completely invisible to radars or satellites. Let's see what happens when a modern cruise ship as big as the Titanic hits one of these small icebergs. Meet the Norwegian Sun, a luxurious cruise ship like Titanic, as it has the capacity to accommodate 2,400 passengers and more than 900 crew members. On July 2022, this cruise ship was on its way to Hubbard Glacier in Alaska when it found itself in the middle of a dense fog. Suddenly, passengers felt an impact and were terrified as the ship experienced a severe jolt. The fog immediately cleared and they realized what had happened. The Norwegian Sun had collided with an iceberg of the growler type. But the outcome was entirely different from Titanic. Thankfully, there were no injuries, and both the passengers and staff reached the Alaskan docks safely. Expert divers checked the condition of the boat, and they discovered that the ship had suffered some damage after the collision, so the rest of the trip was canceled. Now don't stress about packing for your next trip across the Atlantic, because accidents like the one with the Norwegian Sun are really rare. I mean, it's common for ships to encounter ice, but what's unusual is for it to be a problem. Most modern cruise ships wouldn't get physically damaged by an iceberg, and there's a reason for that. You see, the steel used in the Titanic also played a significant role in the disaster. The unsinkable ship, after all, was not so impact-resistant. Back then, the Titanic's hull was constructed using around 2,000 steel plates, which are believed to have been produced in an open hearth furnace. As a result, the steel contained a high concentration of phosphorus, oxygen, and sulfur. High levels of these elements make steel brittle at low temperatures, causing it to fail upon impact. While the steel used on the Titanic was of the highest quality available at the time, it wouldn't meet the safety standards of modern ships, and it was approximately 10 times less safe than what today's vessels use. But the most significant difference between the design of the Titanic and a modern ship lies in how the hull is put together. You see, the Titanic was built using over 3 million rivets for its hull and upper deck structure. So, when it struck the iceberg, the rivets started a chain reaction, causing the entire section of the hull to collapse simultaneously, causing an uncontrollable flood of water. In contrast, modern ships use a method called submerged arc welding, which fuses the edges of metal pieces together, creating a strong and continuous bond. This is safer because if any part of the ship gets damaged, the tear doesn't spread, making things worse. The damage remains contained within that section. Okay, so small icebergs are becoming more common, and vessels have been adapted to deal with them. But there's still one more scenario to consider. What if a huge cruise ship hit an iceberg the size of a 5-story building? Imagine we've just created the world's largest cruise ship on the planet. Let's call it the Bright Seaside. Our floating resort is massive, 4 times the size of the Statue of Liberty. It's longer than the Titanic by 318 feet and carries about 3 times more passengers and crew. And just like the Titanic, our fictional ship can cruise at a top speed of around 23 knots. Now, picture this scenario. The bright seaside is cruising at full speed in freezing waters. It's the middle of the night, and the captain doesn't realize that all the iceberg detecting equipment on board isn't functioning. It stopped working 3 days ago. It's very foggy out there, and the lookout also fails to spot a 45-foot-tall iceberg. If that whole situation played out, and the ship smacked into the iceberg head-on, well, it could potentially lead to a sinking. But you can see how unlikely that is, right? That's why experts are quite confident in saying that ice isn't likely to sink modern cruise ships. It's also worth mentioning that safety measures have improved a lot since Titanic. A modern large vessel can take days to sink, which provides enough time to keep everyone safe. Crews are definitely better prepared to handle evacuation procedures, and passengers should also go through safety training before cruising. I know, it is annoying to do that when all you want to do is drink a lemonade or some other beverage by the pool. But, all these safety tips are what saved the MS Explorer from becoming a modern Titanic. You see, back in 2007, all 154 people on board this Antarctic cruise ship managed to get into lifeboats after the ship hit an iceberg. Now, imagine their panic as they waited for help for 4 hours. The crew did an excellent job in keeping everybody safe, no doubt. But a report that came out 2 years later said that the MS Explorer accident had happened because of the inexperience of the captain, who had pushed the ship too fast into a wall of ice in the freezing waters of Antarctica. That means that no matter how much tech a ship's got or how fancy its materials are, if you've got a careless captain and a crew that doesn't know how to handle an iceberg hit, yep, a disaster similar to Titanic could happen again. But hey, you shouldn't stress over it. Trust the professionals and keep in mind the odds. In the last 30 years, the MS Explorer was the only cruise ship that sank thanks to an iceberg, and everyone survived. So kick back and enjoy your sea vacation. So in 2017, over 25 million people boarded cruise ships all over the world. Now, if you're keeping count, that's more than the total population of Greece. It's become America's favorite choice when it comes to going on vacation. It's easy to see why hopping aboard a cruise ship becomes more popular each year. Heading out on a cruise is also coming back in style with newer generations. 2/3 of Gen Y and Millennials say that cruising is their new preferred type of vacation. How's that? Well, let's see. It's easy to plan in advance. On board, you can find activities for all family members, and you get a chance to visit several different destinations in one trip. An added bonus of booking a cruise? You can sample various places for a future time off. The entertainment on board is often top-notch, providing passengers with an added taste of luxury. And the amenities and accommodations are generally very reliable. Not to mention that it gives tourists that feeling of actually getting away from everything that people strive for while out of the office. Royal Caribbean International is one of the largest cruise lines in the world, with just over 19% of the cruise market as of 2018. Its current fleet is divided into many different classes of ships, including the Voyager class, Radiance, and Quantum. The latest addition to the Royal Caribbean International's impressive fleet was built in 2018. Wonder of the Seas is now the largest cruise ship in the world. Since this spectacular liner has just had her maiden voyage in March 2022, let's look at some of the incredible perks it has to offer its passengers. For starters, the boat is so big that it had to be split into neighborhoods. Well, it figures since Wonder of the Seas can accommodate almost 7,000 passengers. Fond of New York? Well, no worries. Wonder of the Seas has a central park of its own, with an estimated 10,000 plants to check out. The ship's central park is a feature of all Oasis-class ships, being one of the so-called neighborhoods. Let's look at some other areas, shall we? Like this boardwalk, a place that includes an arcade, a candy store, and a sports bar. It's best suited for long walks. There's a pool and sports zone on Wonder of the Sea. These areas feature the ship's numerous pools and hot tubs. There are many activities to check out on the sports court. Then there's the Royal Promenade, or Promenade if you prefer. That's the main road on Wonder of the Seas, with bars, lounges, and places to grab a cup of coffee, or a luxurious latte. The entertainment neighborhood is the focal point for leisure activities on the ship. Here, guests can find a comedy club, an ice skating rink, and even a theater. The spa and fitness area is a tranquil zone with a huge array of treatments available. The fitness center is free of charge, by the way, so there's no excuse for guests to skip a leg day. An extra 8th zone was added to Wonder of the Seas. It's called the Suite Neighborhood. This is an exclusive area designed for guests staying in the suites. Oh, now I get it. It's located at the top of the ship. Guests here have designated staff members called Royal Genies. Yeah, if you rub a lamp in your suite, they appear. Nah, not really. The genies are similar to butlers. They can cater to just a few cabins. Of course, the cruise line wants to divert other guests from asking these crew members various questions and taking their time. That's why the genies don't wear name tags in public areas. As for its itinerary, Wonder of the Seas was initially supposed to be homeported in China, but Royal Caribbean decided to move the liner to the United States. In March 2022, the ship started its journey with 7-night Eastern and Western Caribbean itineraries. In May 2022, Wonder of the Seas is scheduled for a trip to Europe, with Western Mediterranean cruises from Barcelona and Rome planned for its guests. Passengers will also be able to visit Palma de Mallorca, Spain, and Capri, Italy. When the summer season is over, Wonder of the Seas is scheduled to return to Florida to offer year-round sailing starting November 2022. And by the way, there is no truth to the rumor that a special cruise only for highly allergic and hay fever sufferers will be called the Wonder of the Sneeze. Nope, not at all. Now, it's hard to imagine a ship so massive that can accommodate so many amenities on board. For example, the Titanic was the largest ship of its time, measuring 882 feet in length. And Wonder of the Seas is not only 1,188 feet long, it's also 36% taller and 34% wider. Speaking of lifeboats, which I am about to, Titanic had a mere 20 lifeboats on board, which was tragically not enough to fit all the passengers after the ship hit the iceberg. But Wonder of the Seas has an even smaller number of lifeboats, 18 to be precise. Sounds weird and dangerous? Well, not really, given that each of these lifeboats can accommodate up to 370 people. It means that all the passengers and crew members, an estimated 8,000 people if fully booked, are going to be safe in case of an emergency. If we could somehow have a race between the two ships, well, Titanic was in fact the faster ship out of the two, beating Wonder of the Seas by 1 knot per hour. Cruise ship passengers today are more interested in the experience rather than the speed of the boat itself. That's why how fast a ship can travel is not an extremely important aspect nowadays. In terms of costs, Titanic cost around $7.5 million at the time of its construction. It's the equivalent of about $200 million today. How about Wonder of the Seas? Well, it cost a staggering $1.35 billion to build, making it 6 times more expensive than the Titanic. How about we compare ticket prices? Well, in this case, the least expensive ticket on Titanic was £7. It's about $1,000 today. The cheapest ticket on Wonder of the Seas is currently $423, but prices may vary depending on the location, season, itinerary, and how much you tip your Royal Genie. And I know you were going to ask, how about icebergs? Well, Titanic steamed in the frigid North Atlantic, where you had to be on the lookout for those. Wonder of the Seas will be cruising the balmy Caribbean, where the worst thing you can hit on is 17 and blackjack. Oops, busted. Anyway, set side by side with its other sisters from the Royal Caribbean fleet, Wonder of the Seas is equally as impressive. The company's earliest ships could host about 2,500 people. This included passengers and the staff. Such ships were Splendor of the Seas, Legend of the Seas, and the smallest of them all, Thumbelina of the Seas. No, wait, that should be Empress of the Seas. Oops, my bad. The largest ships in the company's fleet can now house about 9,000 people altogether. That's almost 3 times the size and capacity of the earlier liners. Wonder of the Seas is one of them, as well as Harmony of the Seas and Symphony of the Seas. Are you seeing a pattern here? Yep, if you ever encounter a ship with "of the seas" in its name, it's safe to assume it belongs to Royal Caribbean. But if it's a can of tuna, it might actually be Chicken of the Sea. Hey, I like tuna. Now, choosing between cruise ships based on their size is like wondering if you should visit your local museum or the Louvre in Paris. It all depends on your preferences. Some families prefer small settings. Others are fan of large spaces that can provide everything they need. Historically, it's equally as exciting how far we've come in terms of maritime transportation. The SS Royal William, for example, was the first boat to ever make a transatlantic voyage almost entirely steam-powered in 1833. And it was a mere 160 feet long and could house roughly 155 passengers. And if the seas were calm, then they were housed less roughly. Similarly, the first modern megaship in the world was the MS Sovereign of the Seas. Launched in 1987, it was only 888 feet long and could carry a little under 3,000 passengers. Size and capacity are not the single improvements added to newer cruise ships out there. Recent technological developments in artificial intelligence and facial recognition have allowed cruise operators to ensure faster, smoother boarding for passengers. If, in the past, it took from 60 to 90 minutes for all passengers to board a ship, nowadays, cruise ship operators manage to get people comfortably settled in less than 15 minutes. Now, I'm sure you're already eager to book a ticket, but let's look into some of the more interesting activities you can try on board Wonder of the Seas. This way, you'll know what you're getting yourself into. All Royal Caribbean ships have loads of artworks available for their guests to enjoy. But Wonder of the Seas goes above and beyond, even featuring statues of astronauts in key locations around the ship. You'll find the first astronaut looking through the glass at the promenade, while a second one is busy rock climbing at the boardwalk. The third and last astronaut is more of a movie fan. This statue can be found near the movie screen sitting area. Going astronaut sightseeing is proving to be quite the experience among guests. In the areas with no access to sunlight, Wonder of the Seas features virtual balconies. In case of bad weather, guests can still have a feeling of the outdoors, but without having to hide from wind or rain. Teenagers have a place of their own reserved on the ship. There's a special club with a private hot tub, selfie area, games, and comfortable seating. The inside part of this club features a vending machine, an interesting collection of literature, and tables for foosball. Well, sign me up.
It was the start of 1912. A giant chunk of ice broke off a glacier in southwest Greenland. The ice was made up of snow that had fallen thousands of years before the event, perhaps as far back as when mammoths still roamed the earth. The iceberg started its journey. It was a huge thing, more than 1,700 feet long and weighing over 75 million tons. It was also a very peaceful chunk of ice. It steered clear of ships and busy transport routes. And then, it somehow floated much further south than other bergs did. Our iceberg was lucky. Others melt long before they get to these low latitudes. Out of up to 30,000 icebergs that drift away from Greenland's glaciers, only 1% ever make it all the way to the Atlantic. Even after melting into the water for months, this massive block of ice was still almost twice as heavy as the Golden Gate Bridge. The iceberg's top part was towering 10 stories over the ocean surface. Several days before our iceberg made it to the Atlantic Ocean, a magnificent ship left port. It was a luxury liner carrying more than 3,000 passengers and crew members. At that time, it was the largest ship ever built. It was the Titanic. The collisions happened on April 14th, when the ship was in the North Atlantic, 370 miles away from Newfoundland. Unable to divert its course, the ship ruptured at least 5 of its hull compartments. They started to fill with water at an alarming speed. The Titanic's compartments weren't capped at the top. That's why the water spilled over and started to flood each succeeding one. The front of the ship began to sink, causing the back part to lift vertically into the air. And then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what happened to the Iceberg after that? On April 15th, the German ocean liner SS Prinz Aldebert was sailing through the North Atlantic. It was traveling a few miles away from the place where the Titanic had sunk several hours prior. The German ship's chief steward, who hadn't learned about the disaster yet, saw an iceberg. What drew his attention was a large streak of red paint going along the iceberg's base. Surprised, the man took a photo of his discovery. He thought the paint meant a ship had hit the iceberg within the past 12 hours. The next person who saw the iceberg and took another photo of it was the captain of a vessel laying deep-sea telecommunication cables. The ship was sent to help in the area where the Titanic had sunk. The captain later claimed the iceberg he'd seen had been the only one in that area, plus the red paint. It wasn't difficult to connect the dots. In 2015, one of these photos sold at auction for over $32,000. And still, experts are unsure whether the image really shows the infamous block of ice. It might be a simple iceberg that had been floating nearby at that time. The great unsinkable ship was gone, sunken to the bottom of the North Atlantic, where it remains to this day. But the iceberg continued on its way, perplexing a few witnesses and slowly melting into the surrounding water. It would vanish completely before the end of the year.
It was just a couple of hours before midnight. Some of the 2,200 passengers of a large, luxurious ocean liner were still partying in the beautiful first-class lounges. The rest were asleep in their beds, some of them in spacious cabins filled with paintings and decorated with ornate carvings, others in tiny rooms below sea level. All of these people had only one thing in common. On that chilly April night, all of them were heading from Southampton in England to New York City. The ship was called the Titanic, and at that time, it was considered unsinkable. At the very beginning of the journey, the liner nearly collided with the steamship New York. Luckily, the Titanic managed to pass by the other vessel with several feet to spare. A common sigh of relief escaped the passengers crowding the liner's decks. Little did they know what was awaiting them in the near future. Several days later, when the ship was already in the North Atlantic Ocean, 370 miles away from Newfoundland, the unthinkable happened. At about 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, those who were still awake were knocked over by some mysterious and powerful force. Passengers who were already in their beds got catapulted to the floor. Screams and total confusion. Months before the disaster struck, a ginormous chunk of ice had broken away from a glacier in southwest Greenland. It was made of the snow that had fallen about 100,000 years ago, when mammoths were still roaming the planet. When the iceberg just started its journey, it was a huge thing, almost 1,700 feet long. It also weighed 75 million tons. But then it floated much further to the south than normal, right into the area the Titanic had to cross on its way to North America. Even after melting into the water for months, the iceberg still weighed an impressive 1.5 million tons. Its top part was towering over the water for almost 100 feet. Even so, it looked harmless next to the massive ocean liner, but only at first glance. What people saw was just a tiny part of a jumbo piece of ice. The largest part of any iceberg is hidden under the surface, with a mere 1/10 visible above the water. The Titanic iceberg wasn't an exception. The moment the ship collided with it, the vessel was doomed. Unable to divert its course, it crashed into the ice, rupturing at least 5 of its hull compartments. They immediately started to fill with water, which then flooded each succeeding compartment. The front of the ship started to sink. This raised the back part almost vertically into the air, and then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what if what we know about the disaster is not true? What if the ship hadn't been wrecked by an iceberg? What if it had been something more treacherous and way more alive that sank the Titanic? Far, far beneath the surface, in the ocean's dim, dark depths, a shadow lurks. Imagine an enormous creature, round, flat, and full of arms, or rather, powerful tentacles. It resembles a giant squid or octopus, but much, much bigger. Its descriptions go from as long as 10 ships to 1.5 miles long. Rumor has it unlucky sailors sometimes mistake the sea monster for an island, but instead of stepping on dry land, they're dragged down into the ocean. These people meet the Kraken, a legendary creature feared by everyone who sets off on a sea voyage. Usually, the Kraken haunts the seas off the coast of Norway through Iceland and all the way to Greenland. Who knows what has brought the beast further away from home? The waters of the North Atlantic are just as chilly, and the creature feels good and curious. Once it notices the Titanic, the ship has no chances to escape its attention. It's dark. That's why those on the ocean liner don't notice the first alarm bells. The water around the ship starts to bubble. If you strain your ears, you can hear bizarre gurgling sounds. If you strain your eyes, you can see thousands of fish and jellyfish rising to the surface. They feel something's up down below. But even if someone on the Titanic noticed this hectic activity, they wouldn't have time to get out of the way of the horrifying beast. Its enormous size and super long and strong tentacles turn it into a predator you can't escape. A 9-year-old boy standing on the deck knows nothing about the sea monster. He's just watching countless small islands rising out of the sea, very, very slowly. The kid doesn't understand why, but all the blood in his body suddenly runs cold. Hundreds of tiny fish are leaping about in the pools between these sandbanks, but soon they roll off into the water over the sides of the ginormous something. Several sharp points appear above the surface. The intrigued boy thinks they look like horns. They keep growing, thicker and thicker, the higher they rise. Soon they're towering over the massive Titanic, dwarfing the ship. These horns are the Kraken's dreaded arms. The boy is paralyzed by fear, but then he spots the monster's eye. It's as big as an elephant. It makes the kid come to his senses and dash away, screaming like there's no tomorrow. The boy's shouting attracts people. They gather along the ship's side, trying to spot what scared the child so much. And then they see. First one, then more and more passengers and crew members lean over the railing to get a better look. They aren't being careless, they're just in shock. Indeed, it's hard to believe your eyes when they tell you a dreaded beast is about to attack the ship you're on. Plus, it's dark, and no one can see clearly what that huge shadow is. But the next several minutes prove it's not a mirage. All of a sudden, the creature rises one of its monstrous arms and stretches it toward the vessel. It might very well be longer than the liner's entire hull. Women start screaming and fainting. Men seem to be just as terrified. Those who have managed to keep their heads clear sweep up kids and run for shelter. That's when the first powerful hit shakes the vessel. The Kraken's had enough waiting. It's ready for action. Panic engulfs people on board the Titanic. Running around aimlessly and screaming, they create chaos that makes the beast even more interested. Normally, the monster just wants to be left alone. It rests deep down on the ocean floor, using its long tentacles to tether itself to the bottom and lazily hunt for food. It only rises to the surface when the weather's unusually warm, or when it gets disturbed. The Titanic is probably too massive and loud. It draws the creature out of its slumber. When the beast gets to the surface and sees a large, glistening boat, wow, the thing mesmerizes the creature. It holds out one of its tentacles to touch the unusual construction. The material is hard, and the beast wonders if the thing will break when squeezed. Without wasting much time, it wraps several arms around the ship and tries to squish it. Tiny creatures fussing around, falling overboard, and making annoying high-pitched noises start to irritate the Kraken. It's getting angry. Easing its grip, the monster circles the Titanic several times, getting ready for the next attack. This time, the strike is much stronger. It bends the metal and makes it brittle. One more movement of a deft tentacle, and the ship starts to fill with water. The Kraken retreats, as if to enjoy the results of its efforts. But then, it notices the ship trying to speed up in futile attempts to put some distance between itself and the monster. People on board the Titanic heave a sigh of relief. The beast is nowhere in sight. Little do they know that the Kraken never lets its toys get away. The ship is beginning to slow down. Its rear part is slowly lifting up, and the front is going down underwater. Passengers and crew members are falling over onto the decks. Most of them are too scared to make a sound. That's why everything's happening in almost complete eerie silence. Until the ship breaks into two parts under its own weight. The crash is so powerful that it scares away even the Kraken. Spooked, the beast dives back into the ocean, which creates a massive boiling whirlpool in that spot. The suction is dragging what's left of the Titanic to the depths of the ocean. The most tragic thing here, though, the Kraken isn't even interested in people on board the ship. This creature is content to munch on fish. It doesn't need bigger prey. It's the animal's curiosity that's now pulling the huge ship down to the bottom. Does the majestic liner have any hope? I think you know the answer. The Kraken is a colossal squid, a legendary sea monster, the biggest hunk of calamari you ever saw. And if this monster had existed, the world would have changed beyond recognition. The Kraken has powerful tentacles, solid muscles with suckers at the end. They're just impossible to escape. The Kraken can break a ship in half or just pull it down into the depths. But the worst thing about the Kraken is its size. According to old sailor stories, the Kraken reached 5,000 feet in length. That's almost 10 soccer fields. Hey, maybe the Kraken could play soccer. The Kraken legend said the monster was so giant that sailors mistook it for a small island. In past centuries, it would have been impossible to defeat such a beast. If the Kraken existed in reality, it might have had offspring. Yeah, in all the world's oceans, there would be giant monsters that could sink any ship. It's unlikely that the Kraken would have competitors in its habitat, so its population would grow strongly. Since the Kraken is enormous, it would need lots of food, so the population of other large sea animals would fall significantly. Blue whales, great white sharks, other giant squids, all the big sea creatures would be endangered. Many people are starving because of the reduction of large fish in the ocean. Urban economies that rely on fishing will be in decline. Prices for small fish around the world are getting more expensive because it's unsafe to fish. To defeat the Kraken, you need powerful weapons, but the monster is tough to catch. The Kraken belongs to the cephalopod genus. This species includes squid and octopus, some of the most intelligent creatures on the planet. The Kraken is a skilled hunter and will never fight in the open. So, what can you do? You can't track the Kraken because it approaches from the depths, not the surface. Though you may be able to tell that the monster is somewhere nearby if a lot of fish surface. When the Kraken swims, it scares all the fish in the vicinity. But it might already be too late. A huge tentacle emerges from the water, resembling a high tower. This tower falls on the deck of the ship, shattering it. The sailors scream and run. The Kraken lands a second blow, and the vessel is almost capsized. Next, the Kraken wraps its giant tentacles around the ship and pulls it to the bottom. Oh boy! What if the sailors managed to detach the ship from the tentacles of this monster? With the help of powerful weapons, the ship's crew strikes back. The Kraken retreats under the water. It's hurt, angry. It seems the battle is over, but here comes the worst. A whirlpool forms beside the ship. Thanks to its considerable weight, when the Kraken dives, it creates a whirlpool behind it. Like a drain in a giant bathtub, this whirlpool sucks the ship down. The battle with the Kraken is lost. Well, that was unfortunate. You might be able to defeat the monster if you can anticipate its attack in advance. But the Kraken can see you and your ship before you can see it. Colossal squids live in deep waters, and they have the largest eyes among all animals. The squid's eye is the size of a dinner plate. Thanks to this, they can see their prey from far away. Similarly, a Kraken would spot the ship much sooner than sonar could pick up the Kraken. It would always have the drop on you. Well, that's not good. Around the world, cargo transportation by ship is declining. Airlines provide the only safe connection between the continents. This will increase air pollution. The most successful enemy of the Kraken is submarines. They travel at great depths and are equipped with powerful echolocators to help detect the Kraken in advance. Subs are well armed too, and the round metal body is not so easy to destroy. A single Kraken may be defeated by a submarine, but what if there are several sea monsters? 3 Kraken can wrap their tentacles around the submarine and drag it deeper into the water where the pressure will destroy their enemy. In other words, they'll have a crush on you. The existence of the Kraken will have dramatically changed the development of many countries. What if Christopher Columbus, on his famous journey, noticed an island that he thought was the New World? He approaches it, but tentacles emerge from the island and sink Columbus's ship. The colonization of North America is delayed, maybe until airplanes are invented, and the first crewed flight wasn't until the 20th century. There would be no Hollywood, there would be no hamburgers, no famous American music playing. There wouldn't be YouTube, which means you wouldn't be watching this video right now. Worst of all, the internet wouldn't exist either. And all this because of one stupid monster squid. The Vikings wouldn't sail on their long ships to raid and settle foreign territories. The history of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and other Nordic countries would have changed drastically. Hey, maybe the Titanic wouldn't have hit an iceberg, but a giant sea monster instead. Though it's unlikely that people would take trips on huge ocean liners in a world where the Kraken exists. Maybe though, the Kraken isn't all that aggressive. Still, they need a lot of food, and because of the growing population of these monsters, there will be much less food in the ocean. Therefore, the Kraken will increasingly come to the surface for hunting. In the future, the Kraken will migrate closer to the shore. In many countries, people then are not allowed to swim in the ocean. Imagine floating on the waves and a monster the size of a skyscraper is swimming right below you. Relaxing at sea and on the beach will no longer be popular. Many countries that live off tourism become impoverished. When the Krakens grow hungrier, they try to capture prey from land. A huge squid could attack small port cities. Houses, docks, streets, everything can be crushed. A tremendous amount of plastic is thrown into the ocean near the coasts of large countries. Billions of tons of plastic will bother the Kraken. An angry, hungry monster can attack bridges like the Golden Gate Bridge. Imagine that a huge squid surrounds the bridge and blocks all traffic. Some of these squids could break the strong cables with their power, and the entire structure would collapse into the water. Ooh! It's good that the Kraken doesn't really exist to swim in our seas and oceans, at least as far as we know. But could the monster have actually existed? Legends stretch back years, but scientific evidence appeared in the middle of the 19th century. In 1857, a 3-inch diameter squid beak was discovered on the coast of Denmark. Other huge squid remains were found in the Bahamas, and then scientists were convinced that gigantic squids existed. While colossal squid has been officially discovered since then, it's been more than 100 years, and we still don't know what max size they can grow to. The fact is, colossal squids are one of the most elusive creatures on Earth. They live in the depths of the ocean where it's challenging for scientists to reach. Any dive to a greater depth requires powerful, bulky equipment. Underwater bath escapes and cameras make a lot of noise and light, which squids notice from afar. They flee before we can see them. The legend of the Kraken probably appeared because of a real colossal squid. People in the past didn't know about these creatures' existence, so when they saw one for the first time, they described it as a massive, terrible monster. It's difficult to say if these huge squids were the size of a small island, because the truth is, we've only studied about 5% of the ocean. It may be that in its depths, monsters much more terrible than the Kraken swim. Like my nephew, Peter. It seems like we all cried watching the heartbreaking goodbye of Jack and Rose from the Titanic. Oops, spoiler, sorry. But the real-life stories from the sinking of the famous ship were no less touching. Joseph LaRoche was born in 1886 in Haiti to a wealthy family. He was growing up without a dad, but his mother was a self-made woman and a respected merchant. His uncle was the head of his country. Joseph was fluent in French, Creole, and English. At the age of 15, Joseph realized he wanted to become an engineer. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, so he moved to France to get his education. The journey took him a whopping 83 days. Still, in his student years, Joseph met Juliet in a suburb of Paris through a mentor. They soon became friends, and then it grew into something bigger. The couple decided to get married. There was only one problem. Joseph couldn't find a well-paid qualified job even after completing his studies because of racial discrimination. The intelligent young man realized he could do better. Plus, he needed to provide for his growing family. His third kid was on the way. His uncle back in Haiti promised he'd help Joseph secure a job as a mathematics professor. His mother was overjoyed that her son and his family would be living in Haiti. She bought them first-class tickets for the French liner La France as a reunion gift. But that liner had really weird rules separating parents from their offspring for meals. The LaRoches didn't want to leave their youngsters and make them feel sad on a trip across the ocean. So they decided to trade their first-class tickets for La France for second-class tickets for RMS Titanic's maiden voyage. The Titanic was all the hype, and it didn't separate families, so it looked like a great deal. They planned to change for another ship in New York that would take them straight to their final destination in Haiti. The family boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg. They had 3 days to enjoy the luxurious staterooms, a dining salon, a library, and 3 outdoor promenade decks available to second-class passengers. Juliet sent a letter to her father from Titanic's final stop in Queenston, Ireland. She told him they were more than happy with the accommodation. They had 2 bunks in their cabin and a couch that converted into a bed for their youngest family members. The family made friends with some nice co-passengers with whom they had traveled together from Paris. She thought they had been the only other French people on board, so they sat together for meals. Juliet mentioned they had all spent time together on the deck of the liner. She also wrote the people on board were friendly, although some sources say the family had gone through quite a lot of mean stares, gossip, and remarks. On the night of April 14th, their exciting journey came to an abrupt end. Even though Titanic's wireless operators had received warnings about drifting ice from nearby ships, the liner continued to plow ahead at full throttle. It was around 11:40 p.m. when Titanic's hull collided with the Iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The practically unsinkable ship was severely under-equipped with lifeboats, enough for only about half of its 2,200 passengers. The nearest rescue ship, the Carpathia, was too far away to help. A steward woke up the LaRoche family and took them to the lifeboats, as Juliet remembered later. She couldn't speak any English, so everything that was going on seemed even scarier to her. A little after midnight, the crew received the order to give priority to women and children when boarding the lifeboats. Juliet later remembered a terrible panic had begun, as people had been pushing each other to get to the desired seat. At some point, she felt they had pulled away her older daughter and thrown her into the abyss. A moment later, she had joined her Simone in the same emptiness. So, pregnant Juliet and her 2 daughters got spots in Lifeboat 14. But they had to say goodbye to Joseph as the boat was being lowered into the sea. He wrapped his coat around Juliet, saying she'd need it, and promised to get in another lifeboat and see her and the little ones again in New York. The 25-year-old Joseph LaRoche didn't manage to stay true to his word. In a couple of hours, Titanic sank underwater, taking the lives of almost 1,500 people. Joseph was one of them. Juliet and the girls were among the 700 survivors who had been rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia several hours later. Once they reached New York, They were looking through the crowds of people, hoping to see Joseph again. When it became obvious they wouldn't find him, it was time for them to decide what to do and where to go. Without any knowledge of English or money that had gone down with the ship, Juliet managed to survive in America only for 3 weeks, and then had no other choice but to go back to France. Joseph's uncle was no longer able to help them, as others had taken his life 4 months after the Titanic tragedy. In December 1912, Juliet gave birth to a son who she named Joseph after his father. For the rest of her life, she couldn't get over the loss of her beloved husband. That's why she didn't like to speak about what had happened on Titanic and told her children not to mention it. In 1995, a member of the Titanic Historical Society interviewed Louise, who was the last remaining LaRoche child and the last French survivor of the sinking. And that's when the world first heard about this heartbreaking story. It inspired some plays and articles, but it never got the same attention as the story of other passengers. You probably remember the elderly couple going down together in their bed on the Titanic. It was inspired by Isidor and Ida Strauss. They were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. Isidor started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's and turned them into multimillionaires. Isidor and Ida were well known in New York, not only for their wealth and charity, but also for their love and devotion to each other. In 1912, the couple decided to run away from the New York winters and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on huge German liners, but at that time, they couldn't resist the hype of everyone talking about that new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. That's how they ended up in one of the first-class private suites at the top of the ship. The Strauss couple spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. On the night of April 14th, they felt a slight tremor and then left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. They told the passengers not to lose their passes, as they'd need them when everyone got back on board. But the ship was going under. The Strauss couple were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and kids were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. She took the easy decision not to leave her husband on the sinking ship. Ida took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid, saying she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Isidor didn't manage to convince her to save herself, so they stayed together till the end. Some of the surviving first-class passengers later remembered they had seen the couple standing peacefully on the deck, holding hands, just waiting.
The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact. But according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for two reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now, it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. so not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of